Chapter 589. Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at Lu Chen for a while before saying calmly, "I didn't give such an order and I didn't mean to do so recently." His words were a little strange and there seemed to be some repetition in their meaning. However, Lu Chen understood and nodded silently. Given Perfected Lord Tianlan's current power and status, he could naturally end someone's life with a single word. However, if it was inconvenient for him to kill someone, there were many ways to do it for him. As long as the people around him knew what he meant, countless people would do it for him. Perfected Lord Tianlan clearly said that he didn't want to kill White Lotus, at least not recently. This was very important and crucial. However, although Lu Chen was a little less worried because of this, he frowned again. If it wasn't done by Perfected Lord Tianlan, where could White Lotus have gone? Lu Chen lowered his head and pondered for a while. Then, he felt Perfected Lord Tianlan's gaze on him. After a moment of hesitation, he calmly told him the entire process of him looking for White Lotus. In the end, he said softly, "I feel that this matter is a little strange, so I came to tell you." Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at him and suddenly smiled, as if he didn't care about White Lotus's fate at all. He merely sized up Lu Chen and said with a smile, "Are you suspecting me? Aren't you afraid that I'll get angry because of this?" Lu Chen shook his head. "I'm not suspecting you. I'm just here to confirm with you." He paused for a moment before continuing, "If you really had feelings for her, she would definitely die. At the same time, she wouldn't have left so many loose ends." Perfected Lord Tianlan laughed. "You're quite confident in me." Lu Chen said, "After all, you're the one who nurtured me. There's probably no one in the world who knows how powerful you are more than me." Perfected Lord Tianlan said, "Seems like you've improved your other skills while you weren't by my side all these years. You're really good at flattery. You're not embarrassed at all. You're better than me when I was young." Lu Chen lowered his head slightly and said, "You flatter me. When I was in the evil cult, I learned it myself in order to survive." Perfected Lord Tianlan's expression froze for a moment before returning to normal. After pondering for a moment, he said, "Wait a moment." In front of Lu Chen, True Lord Tianlan stood up and called his subordinate who was on duty outside the hall, ordering him to call Shuang from Fuyunji over. Lu Chen subconsciously glanced at the sky outside the main hall, only to see waves of blood surging in the night sky, dark red light blotting out the sky. Although it was late at night, it didn't seem much different from daytime. Of course, this was not a good time to meet and chat. If an ordinary person were to disturb a friend at this time, the other person would probably turn hostile and scold them for having a hole in their brain. However, when Perfected Lord Tianlan gave this order, his expression was indifferent, as if everything was natural. Perhaps in his eyes, this world, the entire world should revolve around him. He had never cared about, or rather, considered the feelings and thoughts of most of the people around him. He only did what he wanted to do. However, the most terrifying thing was that after so many years, the achievements he had, the strength he possessed, his prestige, and his power had made all of this a matter of course. Lu Chen lowered his eyes slightly, his face expressionless. However, he was secretly thinking about how Shuang would feel if she, who was lying in a warm bed, was suddenly woken up and forced to rush here. Would she secretly scold this damned baldy for having a hole in his brain? Lu Chen was suddenly very curious about this. Nowadays, Zhengxianmeng was becoming more and more bloated, and the efficiency of many halls was deteriorating. They were dragging their feet, which was depressing. However, this did not include Fuyunji. For many years, they had been fighting bloody battles with the devil cult, and under the strong management of True Lord Tianlan, who was different from ordinary people, the Fuyun Bureau still had a capable atmosphere. As the hall master of the most powerful hall in Zhengxianmeng, Shuang really set an example. Not long after Perfected Lord Tianlan's order was passed down, she had already rushed to the main hall of Kunlun in no more than a quarter of an hour. Someone had already instructed that if Shuang came, there was no need to inform her and that she could come in directly. Therefore, Shuang hurried all the way, looking a little anxious. It seemed that she was a little worried that there might be something urgent here with perfected Lord Tianlan. However, when she walked into the main hall of Kunlun and saw that Lu Chen was also sitting there, a strange expression appeared on her face. For a very long time in the past, she was often the only one who could accompany perfected Lord Tianlan to do things and preach in the middle of the night. Shuang took a deep breath, but a smile appeared on her face. It was as if she had suddenly completely forgotten the unpleasantness from a few days ago. She first nodded at Lu Chen in greeting, then faced perfected Lord Tianlan and bowed solemnly. She said softly, "My lord, are you looking for me?" Perfected Lord Tianlan nodded, but did not say anything. He only pointed at Lu Chen. Seeing Shui Ying's somewhat surprised gaze turn towards him, Lu Chen had no choice but to tell her about White Lotus again. At the same time, he was also secretly observing Shui Ying's expression. After all, Shui Ying's position on Celestial Dragon Mountain was special. She had been in a delicate situation recently, but she still had such a powerful force in her hands. If she really wanted to do something, even Lu Chen was not confident that he could completely stop this woman. Perhaps only perfected Lord Tianlan could completely suppress her. After hearing Lu Chen's words, Shuang was first surprised, then a thoughtful expression appeared on her face. At the same time, perfected Lord Tianlan slowly opened his mouth and called out to Shuang. "Shuang! Your subordinate is here." Shuang bowed respectfully to perfected Lord Tianlan. Perfected Lord Tianlan said, "I asked you to secretly watch over White Lotus, right?" Lu Chen's heart skipped a beat. Shuang nodded and said, "Yes, I have already arranged for people to watch over her. When she did something unusual a few days ago, we stopped her. However, ever since you agreed to let her go to the western continent's Kunlun Mountain, she seemed to be much more well-behaved when she returned to the Immortal City. Furthermore, you only told me not to let her leave the Immortal City casually. You did not forbid her from leaving the Immortal City on normal days, so I have probably slacked off a little. They will only appear near the borders of the Immortal City. At other times, they are probably careless." Her expression was solemn as she said to perfected Lord Tianlan, "This matter is my dereliction of duty. Please give me a few days' time. I will make the arrangements now and definitely find out the whereabouts of White Lotus and report it to you." Perfected Lord Tianlan said indifferently, "We can talk about other things later. First, go and ask where White Lotus was last seen and who she has been in contact with recently. Investigate properly." Shuang nodded and said, "Yes." She then stood up and quickly left the hall. Sitting at the side, Lu Chen, who had not said a word throughout the entire process, frowned and said, "From what you said just now, could it be that you suspect someone?" Perfected Lord Tianlan harumphed and said coldly with a murderous expression, "In this immortal city, the only ones who dare to go against me and play tricks in the dark are those 4 to 5 old soul formation cultivators. It's good that this matter has come. I was planning to have a good chat with them anyway." Lu Chen looked at his expression and did not say anything. However, he only felt a slight chill around him. The night outside the hall seemed to be getting colder and colder. The wind was also getting stronger. Chapter 590. At daybreak, Lu Chen walked down from Sky Dragon Mountain and strolled on the streets of the Immortal City. The strange and gloomy sea of blood phenomenon in the sky had already seriously affected the most bustling and largest city in the world. In the past, at this time, the Immortal City would have already started to bustle with people coming and going in an endless stream. But today, when Lu Chen walked on the streets, he found that the surroundings seemed a little cold and desolate. There were only a few people coming out from the streets. Some people had left, and some people stayed but were unwilling to go out. Even those who walked out of their houses looked heavy and depressed. After all, the terrifying sea of blood above their heads didn't look like a scene of doomsday no matter how they looked at it. How could anyone be happy about it? Lu Chen frowned slightly. He had thought of this scene before, but he did not expect it to be worse than what he had expected. Although the blood sea phenomenon was only a scenery floating in the sky and had never caused any substantial harm to the people in the immortal city, the atmosphere was still unbearably oppressive. He did not even need to go to Fuyunji to know that the daily reports there must be more and more people leaving. At the far edge of the sky, about 20% of the sky was still bright. It was the original sky with a clear blue color and a few white clouds. There was also the sunlight from the sun that should have risen at this time, reflecting a faint golden light at the edge of the blood sea, telling people that this world was not originally like this. What would the future be like? No one knew. Lu Chen retracted his gaze and suddenly felt a little dispirited. He thought of White Lotus, whose whereabouts were unknown and whether she was alive or dead. He suddenly thought that perhaps leaving this city was also a good way to live. When he sensed this thought, he was also stunned. Although he had thought of escaping this place before, after Supreme Lord Tianlan came out and officially accepted him as a disciple, he announced to the world that he was going to hold a disciple acceptance ceremony and made it clear that this great foundation would be passed to him in the future. Lu Chen had long given up on this idea of escaping. His thoughts were all in this intense and violent power struggle to gain a firm foothold and fight for everything. He had never considered this bitter. Perhaps he was born a commoner. For the sake of power, for the sake of power, for the sake of strength, he could give up everything. He cursed that damned Baldy all day long, but perhaps in the depths of his heart, what he yearned for the most was to become that kind of person. But on this day, for some unknown reason, his will seemed to be slightly shaken. Perhaps, it was just an inexplicable melancholy on the morning of a new day. Lu Chen laughed bitterly in his heart. Just as he was about to leave, he suddenly saw a somewhat familiar figure walking over from the street in front of him. The other party also seemed to see him, and a trace of surprise appeared on his face as he stopped in his tracks. It was Song Wenji. On the street in the early morning, under the oppressive and gloomy sky, they met by chance on this cold and desolate street. Morning. Lu Chen was the first to speak. He nodded at Song Wenji politely but not politely, greeting her. Song Wenji also revealed a trace of a smile. In this oppressive and gloomy street, her appearance was still beautiful. Moreover, perhaps it was Lu Chen's misconception. Under her familiar charm, on this morning, Song Wenji's clear and bright eyes faintly carried a trace of strange innocence. Like a playful child, longing for the beautiful scenery outside the house, secretly running out of the house early in the morning, breathing in the fresh air, running to her heart's content on the small path between the mountains. Her skirt fluttered, the cool breeze swept past her smiling face and hair, leaving behind a clear and melodious laughter like a wind chime. That was an innocent child, that was a beautiful time. Elegant like a bubble, bursting in an instant. She stood under this terrifying dark red sky, still that enchanting seductress. She buried her innocence, changed her smile, walked over, and said with a smile, "Were you busy last night? Why are you here so early in the morning? Did you just come down from the mountain?" "Yes." Lu Chen said smoothly, "Last night, my teacher came to talk to me about something, but it was delayed, so I just came down from the mountain." "What about you?" Song Wenji seemed to say it casually, "I also." "Oh, I went to bed early last night. When I woke up in the morning, I was moved and wanted to go out for a walk." She changed her words. Lu Chen noticed this. After glancing at Song Wenji, he thought that maybe she felt that it was not nice to say that. Lu Chen could stay with perfected Lord Tianlan for a whole night to discuss things, but if she told others that she stayed with perfected Lord Tiehu for a whole night, no matter what she said or did, there would probably be countless rumors immediately. Even though the rumors had already spread like wildfire, it was still a rumor. But no matter what, it seemed that this woman still wanted to maintain her mood and dignity this morning. Lu Chen smiled and nodded, saying to Song Wenji, "You are the most comfortable. I have been busy all night and haven't eaten anything yet. How about this, have you eaten? I'll treat you to breakfast." "Breakfast?" Song Wenji looked at Lu Chen with some surprise. For successful cultivators like them, the normal need for food had actually been reduced to a negligible level. Most of the time, they only had a taste for ordinary people's food. However, perhaps it was because Lu Chen's smile looked gentle, or because in the past few years, after the rumors about her and perfected Lord Tiehu spread, no other man dared to invite her out like this. Was it because he was the disciple of perfected Lord Tianlan? Her heart jumped a few times, then she suddenly revealed a smile. That little bit of pure joy was mixed with the beauty that could charm all living beings. She nodded heavily and said, "Okay." The immortal city was a huge city with countless people. Although there were many cultivators, there were even more ordinary mortals living here. Because of Zhengxianmeng's strong maintenance of order, cultivators and mortals were like two completely different classes, living peacefully in this city. To eat breakfast, of course, they had to go to a place where mortals lived. Lu Chen led Song Wenji through a few streets, came to a street where mortals lived, and turned into a very lively alley. Then, in front of them, was an extraordinarily lively stall. Along the alley, there were at least a few hundred people, either standing or sitting, eating breakfast here, talking and laughing, as if the smoke of the mortal world was blowing in their faces. "Let's do it here, what do you think?" Lu Chen smiled and turned back, saying to Song Wenji. However, the moment he turned back and saw Song Wenji, he was suddenly startled. He saw Song Wenji standing beside him, staring blankly at the alley in front of her. Her eyes were deep, as if she saw something that stirred up her emotions. She actually stood there motionless, as if she did not hear Lu Chen's words at all. Many years of time, at that moment, seemed to flow backward, gently flashing past her eyes. She had a happy and beautiful childhood. Holding that soft and warm hand, she ran here, pointed at the stall, and shouted with a smile, "Sister, let's eat there." "Miss Song." Lu Chen's voice rang in her ears, awakening Song Wenji from her memories. Her body trembled slightly, and then she slightly lowered her head. After a moment, when she raised her head again, she revealed a smile, and said to Lu Chen softly, "Come, I know a very delicious stall here, I'll take you there." Chapter 591. A small wooden table and a shabby chair were placed casually on the roadside of the alley. A canvas was propped above their heads. Usually, it was used to shield them from the sun and rain. But now, it also blocked the dark red glow above their heads, making people feel at ease for no reason. A bowl of wonton, a little sesame oil, sprinkled with fresh green onions, was steaming hot and fragrant. It was somewhat appetizing, making people salivate and have an appetite. A big bowl was placed at the corner of the table, with chopsticks and spoons inside. Song Wenji happily took the white porcelain spoon, squinting her eyes to smell the fragrance. She took a deep breath, revealing a somewhat satisfied expression on her face. Lu Chen looked at her from the side, and then looked at the same bowl of wonton in front of him. After a moment of hesitation, he also picked up the spoon and scooped a mouthful of soup, tasting the taste. Song Wenji was not in a hurry to eat, revealing a somewhat expectant expression. She looked at Lu Chen and said with a smile, "How is it? Is it delicious?" Saying this, she sighed again and said, "This is an old stall for many years. I ate here when I was a child. The taste is too delicious." Lu Chen looked at the bowl of wonton in front of him, a glimmer of light flashed in the depths of his eyes, and then he raised his eyes to look at Song Wenji. This woman, in Tianzhu Hall and even in Zhengxianmeng, with her identity as the adopted daughter of immortal Tiehu, could be said to be in the limelight of the younger generation. Even if she could not completely do as she pleased, but most of the time, she should be free to do whatever she wanted. She had been in Tianzhu Hall for a few years, but in these few years, listening to the meaning of her words, it seemed that she had never returned here to eat the food that she had always been thinking about. Was it because she had been too busy these years and had no time to come over, or was there another reason? And these words, which vaguely revealed some secrets, were heard by ordinary people, but for Lu Chen, it was very easy for him to detect the subtle inappropriateness of it. Logically speaking, Song Wenji should have known about Lu Chen's identity and the suspicious points in her words, but she still said it. What did that mean? Lu Chen was silent for a moment, but he didn't answer Song Wenji's question. Instead, He smiled at her and said, "Looks like you're in a good mood today. Did anything good happen recently?" "How could there be anything good? There should be a lot of bad things." Song Wenji sighed and scooped some soup with a spoon, but she didn't drink it. It seemed that she was afraid of the heat. She swirled the soup in the bowl twice and said, "Do you know what happened in the rain listening building on the mountain a few days ago?" "Yes, I went there that night too. I watched from outside the building," Lu Qin said. Song Wenji glanced at him. For some reason, she seemed a little embarrassed. Her cheeks blushed slightly. At that moment, she was as tender and beautiful as a peach. She was a little shy and a little melancholy. She sighed and said, "I lost face. Did you see it that night?" "I was very embarrassed, wasn't I?" Lu Qin said seriously, "A little embarrassed, but when it comes to losing face, it's definitely not like that. That matter has nothing to do with you. It's all that perverted thief's evil deeds. He deserves to die 1,000 times, but you are innocent and implicated." Song Wenji's eyes flickered like sparkling gems. She didn't look like a little girl who was sad and tearful. She always looked beautiful and charming with a bit of heroic spirit and strength. It was rare to see her weak side. She looked thoughtful and said, "What you said makes sense. Unfortunately, the world is like this. When a woman is humiliated, even if she doesn't lose her chastity, there will be endless rumors." She looked at Lu Chen and asked, "In the past few days, have you heard those rumors about me?" Lu Chen was silent. He didn't know what to say for a moment. To be honest, he had indeed heard those rumors. In this cultivation world where men were respected, a beautiful woman with her clothes torn and tattered at night would naturally cause people's imaginations to run wild and imagine many things and scenes. When it came to these matters, Lu Chen sometimes felt that there was no difference between cultivators and mortals. He didn't say anything, but Song Wenji naturally knew the answer. She shrugged and didn't look particularly angry. She only smiled and said, "But it seems like you don't believe it. That's not bad. People like you are very rare." "I thank you." Lu Chen waved his hand and said, "If I really believed those nonsense, then I would be stupid." Song Wenji's bright eyes stared at him. The expression on her face seemed to be somewhat complicated. After a while, she suddenly opened her mouth and asked Lu Chen, "I heard that a long time ago, you were a shadow in Fuyunji." Lu Chen's heart trembled slightly, but his expression didn't change. He nodded and said, "That's true." Song Wenji seemed to sigh and said, "To be able to go from a shadow that no one knows about to becoming the disciple of a true monarch in the Floating Clouds Bureau, your experiences can really be said to be legendary." "I just had a bit of luck," Lu Chen said lightly. Then he looked at her and said with a smile, "Everything was fine. Why are you suddenly interested in my past?" Song Wenji didn't say anything. On this depressing and gloomy morning, in this bustling mortal street, they sat on a shabby table and chair in the middle of the crowd, like an ordinary husband and wife in the mortal world. They looked at each other with calm expressions. The people around them didn't seem to notice anything, using the smoke and fire to cover the faint fierceness in their eyes. "What does it feel like to be a shadow?" Song Wenji's white, jade-like fingers held the white porcelain spoon and spun it in the bowl of wonton in front of her. As the porcelain spoon gently touched the wall of the bowl, it made a crisp sound. The soup was no longer as hot as before, and there were wisps of white smoke curling up, making her face look a little blurry. Lu Chen thought to himself that she didn't seem to have eaten a single wonton until now. After a moment of silence, Lu Chen said, "Probably because I couldn't eat well or sleep well. I was afraid every day, and my heart was always on edge. I always felt that maybe in the next moment, I would be stabbed to death, or surrounded and captured by a group of people, and then tortured to death." Song Wenji's fingers paused for a moment. In the light white smoke, she raised her head and looked at Lu Chen. After a while, she said softly, "That didn't feel good, right?" "It didn't feel good, so I chose to stab someone to death with a knife," Lu Chen said with a slightly self-deprecating tone, and then he stretched out his palm and said with a self-deprecating smile, "Look, it's stained with blood. Suddenly, Song Wenji's hand came through the white smoke and held Lu Chen's hand. Lu Chen's expression froze, and he almost subconsciously shrank back. He didn't look at Song Wenji, but looked around himself. A fierce intent spread out around him in an instant, and then dissipated. I didn't ask someone to ambush you here. Song Wenji said, after all, you are the most beloved and only disciple of Supreme Tianlan. If something happens to you, no one can bear the wrath of that person, not even me. At that time, I'm afraid even my foster father can't protect me. Lu Chen smiled and said, it seems that I still have a good backer. Song Wenji's eyes were slightly blurred. She looked at the palm in her hand. This man's skin was not delicate, and she felt rough and solid when she touched it. It was as if he was used to holding weapons, but for some reason, it didn't smell blood as she had imagined. It's not easy to be a shadow, she said faintly. Lu Chen looked at her and didn't say anything. Then, as expected, she continued, with some emotion and some contempt, saying, unfortunately, some people are still racking their brains to do it. Lu Chen looked at her without blinking. The smile on his face slowly disappeared, and there was some coldness in his expression. Song Wenji didn't seem to care and let go of her hand. But Lu Chen suddenly turned over his palm and suddenly grabbed her slender, white, and soft palm. Song Wenji looked up at him, her eyes were as clear as water. Lu Chen looked at her for a while, and the frost on his face gradually receded. After a while, he let go of her hand and said gently, quickly eat breakfast, or it'll be cold. Song Wenji looked down at the bowl of wonton, and used her fingers to scoop up a spoonful of soup. But she shook her head, and with an indifferent expression, she stood up and said, it's not good anymore. The taste of when I was young is gone. As she spoke, she threw down the spoon and turned to walk away. Not long after, she left the warm and bustling alley, but in the eyes of cultivators, seemed to be a bit lowly and ordinary. She walked away without looking back. Chapter 592. Old Ma, who had a good night's sleep last night, was in good spirits today, and even his mood was better. Although his situation was not particularly good during this period of time, there were still some annoying things. For example, the way to leave the immortal city, which was a troublesome place, was inexplicably taken away by Chen He. But now that he thought about it, things were actually not too bad. Although the sea of blood in the sky above looked very scary, the legendary or imagined doomsday had not yet appeared. No one knew what the future would be like. Maybe it would be fine. And Chen He, who was proud of his success a few days ago, had his family destroyed overnight. This also made Old Ma secretly feel a little lucky. Perhaps this matter was not necessarily related to leaving the immortal city, but who could say for sure whether it was a blessing or a misfortune? It was better to be content with what he had and do what he had to do now. Besides, Lu Chen's position in Supreme Tianlan's faction was obviously rising day by day. It seemed that his future was not too bad. With this self-comfort, Old Ma felt that life had suddenly become better, and his mood was also cheerful. Many years ago, when he and Lu Chen were still living in seclusion in the remote mountain village of Qingshitang village, he was already very familiar with this set of spiritual victory method. Thus, when he walked briskly up Celestial Dragon Mountain and found Lu Chen outside the main hall of the Floating Clouds department, Lu Chen stared at his cheerful and spirited appearance for a long time. Then, he asked suspiciously, "Why are you so happy? Could it be that you have encountered some great news?" Old Ma chuckled and said, "What are you talking about? I'm in a good mood today, so can't I be happy?" Lu Chen raised his head to look at the gloomy and oppressive sky, and then turned to look at the austere and solemn Floating Clouds Bureau, as well as those people who always had solemn and grave expressions on their faces. He then said to Old Ma honestly, "Everyone on this mountain has a bitter expression on their faces. As long as you are the only one who is relaxed and happy, then everyone will find you an eyesore." Old Ma was taken aback. He quickly looked around and found that it was just as Lu Chen had said. After a moment of shock, he hurriedly pulled him aside and asked in a low voice, "Did something happen again?" "Actually, it's nothing big," Lu Chen said, it's just that the damn Baldy was in a bad mood today. He ran out and quarreled with someone, which caused quite a commotion. He just came back. Old Ma's eyes widened. After a moment, he gasped. What was perfected Lord Tianlan's status? Even among Zhengxianmeng, who was almost invincible in the world of cultivation, he was now the number one in name and in reality. The number one person in Zhengxianmeng was, of course, the number one person in the entire cultivation world. Such a big shot went out to quarrel with someone today. And it caused quite a commotion. Old Ma was not stupid. Although Lu Chen's words did not make it clear, he could figure out that there were only a few people on Mount Tianlong who were qualified to quarrel with perfected Lord Tianlan. As for other people, even if they were Yuanyingzhenren, in front of an angry perfected Lord of Huashan realm, they were more likely to be sent flying with a slap, rather than quarreling with words without violence. Old Ma's original joy suddenly dissipated, but he was not too depressed. After all, it seemed that a fight between immortals would not involve a small figure like him. Instead, he was a little more curious. He pulled Lu Chen and asked, which perfected lord is it? He paused, thought for a moment, and said, I guess it's most likely perfected Lord Tiehu. Perfected Lord Tiehu was old-fashioned and upright. In Zhengxianmeng, perfected Lord Tianlan was not very pleasing to the eye. Everyone knew that there were conflicts between Tianhan Hall and Fuyunji from time to time. Therefore, Old Ma's first reaction was that these two old enemies were quarreling again for some reason, but he did not expect the reaction to be so big this time. Unexpectedly, Lu Chen shook his head and said, It's not perfected Lord Tiehu. Old Ma was stunned and said in surprise, What, it's not that person? It shouldn't be. Could it be perfected Lord Guangbo from Dezayuan? Is he jealous of Fuyunji's recent profits? It's unlikely for the others. Perfected Lord Golden Dragon. He seems. Lu Chen interrupted him and said, Stop guessing. It's perfected Lord Guyu from Starry Hall. Perfected Lord Guyu. Old Ma was really shocked this time. There was even a look of disbelief on his face. He said, It shouldn't be. Isn't Starry Hall on good terms with us recently? Not to mention the other things, Starry Hall handled and guarded the devil cult's catacombs at the foot of the mountain together with us. Why are the two of them quarreling? Lu Chen shrugged and said, Who knows? I heard that perfected Lord Guyu punished a few of his trusted disciples. One of them was accused of being too close to Fuyunji. When the news came out, the damn Baldy flew into a rage. He ran to perfected Lord Guyu and quarreled. He even said that your Starry Hall is not clean either. You're always stuffing nails and shadows into Fuyunji. Don't think that we don't know. Old Ma was speechless for a moment. Although what Lu Chen said sounded unbelievable, he really didn't dare to deny it. Because he knew in his heart that these words were very likely to be true. However, there seemed to be something strange about this matter. Do you feel that there's something wrong with this matter? Lu Chen pulled Old Ma and walked around the Floating Clouds Department's main hall towards the Kunlun Palace at the back. At the same time, he asked Old Ma in a low voice. Old Ma nodded very honestly. After a moment of silence, he said hesitantly, logically speaking, the two of them are of such high status. How could they, they shouldn't quarrel so easily. Lu Chen said faintly, because I just talked to the damn Baldy last night. He said that our Fuyunji may have been stuffed with many spies. Maybe there are people who betrayed us and took the initiative to collude with those outsiders. So, the damn Baldy seemed to be very angry early in the morning. When he heard the news from Starry Hall, he angrily went over and quarreled with them. Old Ma was a little stunned and said, That's it. Lu Chen nodded and said, That's it. But then he smiled and said thoughtfully, But I always feel that he seemed to be doing it for someone to see. What do you think? Old Ma was silent. These words, including some deeper speculations, could be said by Lu Chen at will, but he had some taboos. He looked at Lu Chen from the corner of his eyes. He saw that Lu Chen's face was solemn. He seemed to be thinking about something, but his eyes gradually brightened. Probably, he is finally going to start. Chapter 593. Everyone on Sky Dragon Mountain knew that the relationship between the 6 perfected cultivators of the divine transformation realm was a little subtle. The reason for this was very simple and easy to understand. They were all figures who stood at the peak of the cultivation world of the human race, and all other mountains were insignificant. Those who could ascend to this position were all peerless talents. Not to mention aptitude, in this regard, rare talent was only the most basic thing. It could even be said that at this level, precious qualities such as hard work, indomitable spirit, and unyielding perseverance were nothing. Instead, luck and opportunity became the key to the final separation between gods and mortals. Humans were not born to be fair. You have your opportunities, and I have my fate. In short, those who could become deity transformation stage perfected monarchs could almost be seen as divine rights bestowed by the heavens. They were favored by the heavens, so they were naturally proud and arrogant people. They were all great geniuses, all big shots with their eyes on the top of their heads, and all of them thought that they were the best in the world. Therefore, when they saw that there were actually people around them who were similar to them, they would naturally be a little displeased. Regarding this, even the most low-key and peaceful perfected cultivators of the divine transformation realm would probably have such thoughts. Therefore, although these perfected cultivators of the divine transformation realm in Zhengxianmeng were highly respected and powerful, they had always kept a certain distance from each other. And the occasional frictions and quarrels between them were like gossip that the people of Sky Dragon Mountain never got tired of, and had always been the topic of people's leisure time for many years. It seemed that this quarrel between the 2 perfected cultivators of the divine transformation realm, Tianlan and Guyu, seemed to be one of these immortal fights that no one was surprised to see. Although perfected cultivator Tianlan seemed to have gone a little too far by going from his own territory to the Star Hall and quarreling with perfected cultivator Guyu, although no one really heard of it, and no one really felt that there were signs of a big fight or Tao or divine powers inside, the scene was still quite frightening. Perhaps it was because perfected Lord Tianlan was so powerful that he was bursting with ambition and could no longer tolerate being treated as an equal to others. In fact, he could no longer suppress his ambition and was about to take action. This conjecture immediately spread like wildfire after the quarrel between the 2 bigwigs. In a short time, it spread throughout the entire Sky Dragon Mountain. In the blink of an eye, it even overshadowed the drama of immortal Tiehu punishing the perverted thief in the rain listening tower for the sake of his adopted daughter a few days ago, and became the focus of everyone's attention. In addition to the fact that both sides of the quarrel were frightening big shots like perfected gods of Huashan realm, there was another point that had secretly attracted many people's attention. According to the original view, perfected Lord Tianlan's Fuyunji was now well deserved to be the number 1 force in Zhengxianmeng, and the force closest to them seemed to be Starry Hall. But now, it seemed that perfected Lord Tianlan, who had always been arrogant and condescending, and was arrogant even among perfected lords of the divine transformation realm, had finally lost his rationality and could no longer tolerate anyone's disrespect towards him. So, he went to Starry Hall and scolded perfected Lord Guyu. It was said that perfected Lord Guyu was so angry that his face turned pale at that time, and had a big quarrel with the famous bald perfected Lord Tianlan. During the quarrel, he even disregarded his identity several times and sarcastically ridiculed perfected Lord Tianlan's shortcoming of not being able to grow hair on his head, further infuriating perfected Lord Tianlan. Of course, big shots at this level basically used their mouths and not their fists. Once they started fighting, it would basically cause a landslide. Wise people would not take it, and people would not like it. After the incident, everyone in Starry Hall was half dead with anger. After all, everyone was a famous force in the world, and they really could not bear the humiliation when someone came to their door and slapped them in the face. But if that person was called Tianlan, forget it, they had to bear it even if they could not bear it. However, since then, the relationship between Starry Hall and Fuyunji instantly became like fire and water. Both sides were at daggers drawn, and there were many incidents of people quarreling and even fighting each other. It was a joyous occasion. Lu Chen was summoned by someone sent by perfected Lord Tianlan. When he walked to the entrance of Kunlun Hall, he happened to see Shuang also there. At the entrance of the hall, the two of them happened to meet. Lu Chen glanced at this woman and found that she seemed to be a little tired. He did not know if it was because she had been too busy recently and was under too much pressure. Thinking about it, it must have been hard on her. Originally, a large hall like Fuyunji already had a lot of affairs to deal with, but the big shot at the top did not stop worrying. He just had to find trouble and quarrel with the perfected Lord of Soul formation of Starry Hall, causing an uproar in the city. It was enough to give her a headache. Thinking of this, Lu Chen smiled slightly, but took half a step back and made a gesture of letting Shuang go first. Shuang was obviously startled and could not help but take another look at Lu Chen. Ever since the power struggle outside Chen He's house, the relationship between the two had deteriorated rapidly. Unexpectedly, Lu Chen seemed to take a step back today. But no matter what, this was also a kind gesture. Shuang was not the kind of woman who put everything on the surface. Although she had some doubts in her heart, she still put on a gentle expression and nodded at Lu Chen. After pondering for a while, she still walked through the door first. After all, there were many eyes and ears watching in the surroundings. Perhaps this situation could let them understand something. There were no outsiders in the hall. Only perfected Lord Tianlan sat there and seemed to be cursing. When he saw them enter one after another, his gaze swept across them. His expression did not change much, and he beckoned them over. Seeing that this person seemed to be a little angry and anxious, Lu Chen frowned. He felt that this damn Baldy was a little unusual. At least in his memory, he had almost never seen him not calm like this. When Shuang and Lu Chen approached, perfected Lord Tianlan did not let them sit down and talk. He asked directly, "I heard that there were people who had a dispute with Starry Hall and even fought?" Shuang nodded and said, "Yes, there were 17 disputes between the two sects in the past few days. I have already dealt with 5 of the fights and detained the people who fought." Perfected Lord Tianlan snorted and said, "Have you found out that it was them who started it first?" Shuang hesitated for a moment and a trace of awkwardness flashed across her face. She said, "It was just a verbal argument. Most of the time, it was Starry Hall who started it. However, for the 5 fights, it was us who started it first." Lu Chen rolled his eyes in his heart. He thought to himself, the Floating Clouds Company's reputation for being domineering these days was indeed well deserved. It was clearly his boss who had acted rudely, scolding others in their territory. In the end, he was still arrogantly bullying others. Perfected Lord Tianlan snorted again and said, "Who won and who lost the fights?" Shuang said, "Most of the time, it was our people who won." After a pause, she lowered her voice a little, but the two people around her could still hear her clearly. She said, "Most of the time, we have more people. More people bullying less people. This is no different from a street gangster," Lu Chen thought. At this moment, perfected Lord Tianlan said angrily, "Well done, release the people you detained. That old fart Gu Yu dared to call me Baldy. This time, I must teach him a lesson." Chapter 594. True Lord Tianlan's embarrassment turned into anger after being scolded bald, and then he flew into a rage and even vented his anger. This kind of behavior was very strange and incongruous when it happened to true Lord Tianlan. However, it was common knowledge that every big shot who had reached the level of divine transformation true Lord actually had the right to do as they pleased. Most of the time, they were aloof and seemed to be above the common people, but as long as they were willing, they could also put down their pride and haggle without any scruples. If the same thing happened to an ordinary person, it would be vulgar and shallow, but if true Lord Tianlan did it, True Lord is indeed a man of character. You love and care for your subordinates, and you are also wise and mighty. It is our great fortune to be able to serve you. Shuang revealed an excited expression and sincerely expressed her loyalty. At the side, Lu Chen couldn't help but stare at Shuang a few more times. The expression of surprise on his face clearly said, "I didn't think that a powerful and arrogant hall master like you would actually know how to flatter." Although Shui Ying's expression remained the same under Lu Chen's gaze, there was still a trace of unnaturalness in her eyes, as if she was a little embarrassed, but she quickly concealed it. True Lord Tianlan seemed to be very satisfied with Shui Ying's attitude. He nodded and said to her, "I trust you when you do things. Let's do as we said earlier and secretly make those people from Starry Hall suffer a little. But don't make things too big. Although I'm not afraid of trouble, I also want to avoid breaking that old man Gu Yu's tail and making him jump up and bite people." What he meant was that he was directly comparing that person from Starry Hall to a dog. In this world, there was probably only one person who could be so unscrupulous towards a divine transformation true lord. Shuang and Lu Chen didn't dare to say anything. Shuang agreed and quickly retreated. Lu Chen watched her figure disappear through the door, then looked back at True Lord Tianlan and frowned. "She was just flattering you." True Lord Tianlan's expression had already relaxed. Hearing this, he casually spread his hands and said, "Yes, but that was her own action. I couldn't do anything about it." Couldn't do anything about it? There was an old saying, when the superior likes something, the inferior will follow it. Lu Chen shook his head and opened his mouth to say something, but in the end, he closed it. True monarch Tianlan did not notice Lu Chen's expression and said to him, "Let Shuang handle the matters of scheming with the other mountains in the Immortal Alliance. She is familiar with everything and has experience, so there is no need to worry. I called you here because I have something else to tell you." Shuang asked. Shuang said. "The people below have been investigating for a few days. Although they have not found White Lotus's whereabouts, on the last day, there were people who saw her figure in 3 different places." After saying that, he looked at Lu Chen meaningfully and told Lu Chen 3 locations in chronological order. These 3 places were not on Mount Celestial Dragon but on the streets of the Immortal City. Lu Chen's brows slowly furrowed. He counted the days in his heart and recalled the few hours that Supreme Lord Tianlan had mentioned. Suddenly, his expression changed abruptly. There was shock in his eyes as he raised his head to look at Supreme Lord Tianlan. True Lord Tianlan smiled and said, "Looks like you've thought of it." Lu Chen took a deep breath and said slowly, "Those 3 hours on that day, I happened to pass by those 3 places." After a pause, Lu Chen narrowed his eyes and said, "So she was secretly following me that day." Moo! A low cry came from the entrance of the main hall of Kunlun. Lu Chen looked in that direction and saw Oxen's huge body walking past the entrance of the main hall, followed by a black figure. It seemed to be Atsu. These days, Atsu would often come to play with Oxen. However, since Oxen was suddenly suppressed in the underground cave and suffered a great loss, Atsu's attitude towards Oxen seemed to have a subtle change. They no longer respected Oxen as they used to. They seemed to have realized that Oxen also had a weakness. But no matter what, Oxen was still powerful, so Atsu seemed to be willing to play the role of a follower until now. Lu Chen recalled that he seemed to have been brought into that underground cave by the green ox that day. His heart skipped a beat and he turned to look at Perfected Lord Tianlan again. Before he could speak, Perfected Lord Tianlan had already said, "Go. It seems that you have a clue. I don't care what you're going to do. In short, I want to see her if she's alive, and I want to see her corpse if she's dead." Lu Chen was silent. Then, he nodded and turned to walk out. When he walked out of the door, he paused and then barked at Atsu, who was not far away. Atsu took a look at Oxen and quickly ran to him, wagging its tail at him, looking very friendly. Lu Chen said, "Accompany me to do something." "Woof!" Atsu barked. It looked like he agreed. Lu Chen glanced at Oxen, who was lying lazily on the side, and strode over. Seeing that the 2 most capable and powerful people under him had left, True Lord Tianlan sat on the spot for a while and slowly let out a long sigh. A hint of fatigue actually appeared on his face. As if affected by his sigh, a golden light suddenly lit up on his chest. A moment later, the Kunlun seal actually flew out of his clothes and floated in the air. True Lord Tianlan took a look at the Kunlun seal and frowned, but didn't say anything. He casually waved his sleeve in the direction of the door, and an invisible gust of wind blew past. Immediately, there was a series of snapping sounds, and the many doors and windows in the Kunlun Hall were all closed. You have to be careful too. There are eyes and ears everywhere on this mountain. What if someone sees something strange and becomes suspicious? Black Dragon's thunderous voice rang out in the golden light. There seemed to be a hint of mockery in it. Didn't you say that this is the safest and most reliable place in the world? Why are you afraid of that? True Lord Tianlan smiled bitterly and said somewhat helplessly, who can really be absolutely safe? Enough of this nonsense. Black Dragon's voice sounded a little impatient. Let me ask you. This time, when the blood moon is at its peak, we will completely destroy the underground demon clan. This matter is simple and clear to begin with. Why are you stirring up trouble again and again here, giving rise to new problems and tormenting yourself endlessly? If something important is delayed, remember that I won't let you off. Faced with the Black Dragon's sudden threat, True Lord Tianlan's expression didn't change. With a composed expression, he said indifferently, Don't worry, I will naturally do what I have to do. However, I think you don't mind taking advantage of this rare opportunity to do some trivial things while I'm at it? The golden light flickered and the Black Dragon's panting could be heard from the depths of the light. At the very least, it sounded a little angry. However, for some reason, such a huge divine beast seemed to be somewhat fearful of True Lord Tianlan. After a while, the Black Dragon sneered and said, You just have to control yourself. Otherwise, if you mess up something important, don't worry about me turning against you when the time comes. With that, the Black Dragon's voice disappeared. The golden light in the air faded and the Kunlun seal flew back to True Lord Tianlan's hand in a swaying manner. Perfected Lord Tianlan gripped the golden seal gently with a cold expression. Chapter 595. The street leading to the underground city in the White Tiger district of the Immortal City was still tightly guarded. The curtains were still erected to block the curious gazes of ordinary people. However, what was different from before was that only Fuyunji's faction and Starry Hall's Fuyunji's faction were left. As for the reason, it was very simple. After the big fight between True Lord Tianlan and True Lord Guyu of Starry Hall, even if the two factions usually got along well, they were probably not on good terms anymore. Not only could they not get along with each other peacefully, they had to glare at each other, gnash their teeth, curse each other, and yell at each other. Then, the people of the Starry Hall would flick their sleeves and leave in disdain, and the people of the Floating Clouds Agency would take over the situation triumphantly. Everyone was happy, and they all felt that they had won. Not only did they gain face for their boss, but they also stood their ground and avoided hurting themselves. It could be seen that those who could survive in the true Immortal Alliance were all sly and cunning. After Lu Qin came down from the mountain and brought Atsu here, he saw this very peaceful and joyous scene. Someone had already come up to greet him with a smile. One had to know that this young man's status was not ordinary now. In the future, he might even be able to sit in the position of True Lord Tianlan. Although there was still Hall Master Shuang of Fuyunji standing there, and it was said that she was not on good terms with her, no one was stupid. Hall Master Shuang of course had True Lord Tianlan's trust and power, but after so many years, why didn't he take Shuang in as his disciple? It was said that strength was respected in the cultivation world. However, the invisible and intangible status was still everywhere in reality. Lu Qin very politely greeted the leader of the guards called Lu Ting, and then said to him, Lord Tianlan sent me over to do something. Lu Ting nodded without hesitation and said, Of course. Is it enough for you alone? Do you want me to send another team to follow you? Whether it's to run errands or to help with some chores, it's fine. Lu Qin pondered for a moment and said, I don't think so. But thank you for your good intentions, Chief Lu. Lu Ting laughed heartily, his eyes narrowing as he smiled. He said in an extremely amiable manner, Young master is too polite. In short, everything will be as you wish. In any case, we are all here. If you need anything, just tell us and we will be there immediately. Lu Qin smiled and nodded. He couldn't help but take another look at Lu Ting. After a moment, he took 2 steps to the side. As expected, Lu Ting followed. Lu Chen smiled and said, "Chief Lu, thank you very much. But I remember that the brothers and colleagues stationed here should be the elites of Fuyunji. If you are so close to me in public, isn't it a little inappropriate? Be careful not to be bullied later." After saying this, Lu Chen paid attention to Lu Ting's expression. Sure enough, Lu Ting's expression stiffened for a moment, but then returned to normal. Then, with a sincere expression, he said, "Young master is thinking too much. But this subordinate will remember this intention. This subordinate belongs to Fuyunji and has been risking life and death here for many years. Although I am slow-witted, I still understand one thing. All the brothers here, including all of Fuyunji, will not belong to anyone other than Lord Tianlanlan. Even if there is such a person, it can only be the one that Lord Tianlan has recognized and recognized." At this point, it was basically impossible to go any further. The occasion and atmosphere were not suitable, but Lu Ting's meaning was very clear. Lu Chen's brows drooped, but he felt a little emotional. Although it had been a few days since he quarreled with Shuang, and it had been even longer since he officially became Lord Tianlan's personal disciple, other than old Ma who was originally with him, there was also Chen He, who he had instigated to defect to him, but then defected to Shuaying's side. During this period of time, no subordinates of Lord Tianlan had come to his side. This Lu Ting, regardless of his position, character, or even strength, was the first person who had intentionally switched sides from the original Fuyunji system. Could this be the beginning? Who would have thought that they would encounter such a thing by accident on this trip? Although the real effect might not be very great, and even Lu Ting's sincerity in defecting still needed to be tested, but in the end, cracks were beginning to appear in the solid Fuyunji system. Lu Chen was still very happy. He smiled and nodded to Lu Ting, whispered a few words to him, and then led Atsu into the underground world through the tunnel entrance. Behind him, Lu Ting respectfully escorted them all the way to the tunnel entrance. Only after Lu Chen's figure had disappeared did he straighten up. At this moment, one of his trusted aides came over and said in a low voice, "There's no one around, our subordinates are all watching." Lu Ting nodded and replied, That trusted aide hesitated for a moment and said, "Brother Lu, will there be trouble if you do this?" Lu Ting snorted and said, "What trouble? I didn't do anything. Young Master Lu Chen is Lord Perfected's disciple. There's nothing wrong with me serving him respectfully. You can't expect a small character like me to treat him coldly, right?" After a pause, he said again, "Pass down the order, no one is allowed to know about what happened today. Even if someone asks, they can only say that I'm a coward and don't dare to slight young Master Lu." "Got it." That trusted aide showed a look of understanding and also smiled. While the two of them were talking, among the ordinary guards in the distance, an ordinary-looking guard who was standing next to a cloth curtain in the periphery glanced over coldly at them. Lu Chen's memory was very good. He would remember many things from a long time ago clearly, no matter if these memories were pleasant or painful, including those days and nights spent in the Devil sect. Therefore, even now, when he was arguing with others, he would suddenly think of the woman who was killed by the evil cult. After a while, he would remember the woman's name and other things. This was somewhat like a talent. Those things seemed to be engraved in his mind. Most of the time, it was just a deep sleep. Lu Chen had long gotten used to this habit of his, even if most of the time, this kind of memory brought him more pain. But on this day, when he once again stepped into the underground city shrouded by the blood moon, when the blood-red light once again fell on his body, Lu Chen suddenly felt the power of the black fire in his body suddenly tremble, as if it was about to boil. Perhaps in the real world outside, the sea of blood in the sky was gradually approaching its climax. Or perhaps for some reason, the strange aura of the underground world was becoming stronger and stranger. At that moment, when Lu Chen was subconsciously suppressing the power of the black fire in his body, he suddenly felt as if there was a roar in his mind. His body trembled, and then there seemed to be a strange bolt of lightning suddenly piercing through the dark sky in his mind, illuminating some of the deep shadows. Suddenly, a drop of sweat quietly slid down his forehead. He stopped in his tracks and was in a daze. At that moment, he discovered that in the memory that he thought was complete, there seemed to be an additional blank space. At the last moment of the Battle of the Desolate Valley, when he woke up again, he had completely lost his memory of that period of time. Chapter 596. In the main hall of the Heavenly Law Hall, it was solemn and dignified as usual, but because of the arrival of a distinguished guest, it added a bit of liveliness to the place. This guest's status was extremely high, so much so that even immortal Tiehu had to personally go out and greet him. Then, he would accompany and chat with him. All the surrounding subordinates were dismissed, leaving only his most beloved adopted daughter, Song Wenji, to serve tea at the side. Looking at the entire Zhengxiameng and the entire Tianlong Mountain, there were only a few people who could afford the solemn reception of a character like Tiehu Supreme. Needless to say, they were the few big shots who were at the deity stage like him. The person who came to visit today was Zhengxiameng, Guangbo Supreme, who was nicknamed Hidden Minister. This Guangbo Supreme had a venerable status in Zhengxiameng, and had great power. Although generally speaking, the Grand Chancellor that he ruled was not famous for its valiant fighting power, almost no one in the entire Zhengxiameng was willing to offend them, including the strongest Fuyunji. Because the Grand Chancellor was in charge of the property in Zhengxiameng, and distributed it to each hall according to the rules, for a long time, the Grand Chancellor was the most powerful branch in Zhengxiameng. That was to say, in the last few decades, the situation has changed. Well, to be exact, in Zhengxiameng, there was an extremely powerful but often did not act according to the rules, Tianlong Supreme. After founding Fuyunji, this bald supreme unexpectedly left the Grand Chancellor, and set up a lot of his own businesses, and the income was extremely considerable. Of course, it was hard to say how much of this was due to the incomparable strength of Fuyunji. In short, Fuyunji now did not rely too much on the Grand Chancellor. On the contrary, after Fuyunji's power grew and gradually overtook all the halls in Zhengxiameng, it began to openly and secretly force the Grand Chancellor. The result was that the Grand Chancellor was arrogant and swaggering in front of other halls, but when it saw Fuyunji, it was like a mouse seeing a cat. Not only could it not take advantage of Fuyunji, but it obediently handed over the money every month, and from time to time, it would also be hit by Fuyunji. This was really a shame that the Grand Chancellor had not seen for more than 100 years. As the current leader of the Grand Chancellor, Supreme Guangbo was deeply annoyed, but when they faced Fuyunji, it was like a scholar meeting a soldier, there was really nothing they could do. Even though Supreme Guangbo himself was also a perfected lord of Huashan realm, the damn bald Tianlong was too strong. Although he always pretended to be brave and spoke in a tough tone, he knew in his heart that if he really fought with the damn bald Tianlong, the chance of winning would not exceed 50%. Brother Guangbo. A call awakened Supreme Guangbo from this unpleasant thought. He looked up and saw Supreme Tiehu sitting next to him looking at him with a smile. He said, "This is the best immortal tea that was served a few days ago. It is said to be a rare treasure in the world. To be honest, did you come here specially because you heard about this thing?" Supreme Guangbo laughed and said, "Brother Tiehu still knows me well." While talking and laughing, Song Wenji next to him leisurely walked over and carefully served the immortal tea. Supreme Guangbo glanced at her and was slightly startled. He saw that in the white smoke and the fragrance of the tea, this woman's face was charming and beautiful, but also seemed to have a trace of mystery, which was a kind of soul-stirring feeling. He slightly narrowed his eyes and then said to Supreme Tiehu with a smile, "I guess this must be your famous daughter, Song Wenji." Song Wenji's cheek slightly blushed. She took 2 steps back and returned to Supreme Tiehu's side. Supreme Tiehu looked at Song Wenji with affection and said casually, "She is a little girl, how can she be famous?" But speaking of this, he seemed to suddenly think of something. His expression suddenly darkened and he snorted, "It seems that you have also heard about the incident in the rain-tasting tower a few days ago?" Supreme Guangbo smiled and nodded, but in his heart, he felt that this old man Tiehu really wanted to save his face. Everyone was on Mount Tianlong, and the incident was so big that even the blind and deaf people on the mountain would know about it. However, he certainly could not say so in order to save his face. After that, Supreme Guangbo said that the dead perverted thief deserved to die, and that, Brother Tiehu is old but vigorous, eliminating evil for the people, was really not to be underestimated. Steel Pot Lord was originally very happy, but for some reason, when he heard the words old but vigorous, he suddenly felt a little suspicious and embarrassed. But when he carefully looked at Guangbo Lord, he found that this person's expression was calm and composed, as if he had no other intentions. Supreme Tiehu drank a mouthful of tea and calmly hid his thoughts. Then he said to Supreme Guangbo, Brother Guangbo, you rarely come to my place, but you suddenly came here today. Perhaps, other than this immortal tea, do you have any advice? Supreme Guangbo chuckled and nodded slightly, but did not speak immediately. His eyes just casually glanced at Song Wenji who was standing at the side. Song Wenji immediately felt his gaze and hesitated. She glanced at Supreme Tiehu and moved slightly, intending to leave. However, after being glanced at by her gentle eyes, Supreme Tiehu seemed to be unconcerned and smiled at Supreme Guangbo, saying, Wenji is the person closest to me, and also the most reliable confidant. Nowadays, there are many important and secret matters that I have entrusted to her. You can speak freely. Supreme Guangbo frowned slightly, feeling a little unhappy. But he was after all a shrewd person, otherwise, he would not have been able to maintain the Dezayuan so well under the pressure of the unusually strong Supreme Tianlan and Fuyunji. Therefore, after quickly weighing the pros and cons in his mind, Supreme Guangbo decided to ignore Song Wenji's existence. But before he spoke to Supreme Tiehu, he secretly glanced at the woman from the corner of his eye. He thought to himself, this woman is indeed a natural foxy beauty. Tiehu is old and muddle-headed. I'm afraid that he will fall for her. To be honest, Brother Tiehu, I indeed have an important matter to discuss with you. Supreme Guangbo said. Supreme Guangbo saw that he was serious and did not seem to be joking, so he immediately became serious. At the same time, he faintly felt that it was not appropriate to let Song Wenji stay. After all, both he and Supreme Guangbo were deity transformation stage supreme. If there was an important matter, it would indeed involve a lot of people. It was better to keep it a secret if possible. However, since he had already said it, there was no reason to take it back. Therefore, after a moment of hesitation, Supreme Guangbo threw this thought to the back of his mind and said, Brother Guangbo, please speak your mind. Supreme Guangbo said, recently, in the Immortal Allies, the people of Fuyunji have become more and more arrogant. They have bullied their fellow Taoists, imposed exorbitant taxes, and exploited the common people. Brother Tiehu must be aware of this, right? Supreme Guangbo's spirit was lifted, but he did not show any excitement on his face. After a moment of silence, he said, I have indeed heard of this. Song Wenji stood respectfully behind Supreme Guangbo, looking down and motionless, as if she did not exist here at all. Supreme Guangbo raised his voice slightly and said with some melancholy, Tianlan, that bastard, does all these evil things all day long. It's really hateful. The day before yesterday, he was so domineering that he went directly to the Star Hall to bully Guyu. Brother Tiehu, you are the master of Heavenly Law Hall. The rules of the Immortal Allies should be maintained by you. Supreme Guangbo slightly raised his eyebrows, but he was suddenly furious. You old man Guangbo, you don't dare to fight against that lunatic Tianlan, so you come to instigate me to fight against him? Do you think I'm old and senile? Do you think I'm a fool? Supreme Guangbo smiled coldly, and his smile was full of coldness. Chapter 597. Immortal Tiehu was angry, but he was an experienced perfected immortal of Huashan realm, so he did not lose his temper immediately. Instead, he took a deep breath, picked up the teacup in front of him and took a sip. Song Wenji, who was standing beside him, knew her adoptive father very well. She immediately felt the fluctuation of his mood and secretly glanced at Immortal Tiehu. After a while, True Lord Tiehu's expression calmed down. He revealed a smile and said to True Lord Guangbo, Brother Guangbo, it's not like you don't know the current situation in the Immortal Allies. The Fuyan Agency has always been strong. Now that they have defeated the devil cult, their reputation has increased. I don't think anyone in the Immortal Allies can control Tianlan and the others. As he spoke, he shook his head and sighed, looking very regretful. Immortal Guangbo snorted and said with an indignant expression, I didn't expect Brother Tiehu to be so discouraged. If this goes on, I'm afraid that the righteousness will die out and there will be trouble in the future. Immortal Tiehu raised his eyebrows slightly and looked at Immortal Guangbo. He said with a faint smile, Brother Guangbo, it seems that you have something to say. Do you have a wonderful plan in mind? You can tell me and let me hear it. Immortal Guangbo said excitedly, Tianlan and Fuyunji are getting more and more arrogant, and they don't take other people in the Immortal Allies seriously. Not only that, their ambitions are getting bigger and bigger, and their hands are getting bigger and bigger. They have been nibbling away at many industries in the Immortal City. In the past 5 years, the income of the Dazayuan that I lead has been declining year by year, which means that the income of the Immortal Allies has been decreasing, but Fuyunji is getting richer day by day. The root cause is that Fuyunji is taking advantage of its power to bully others and gradually devour a lot of the output. Immortal Tiehu nodded slowly. With his status, of course, he knew about the changes in Zhengxianmeng. However, these things were not easy to say, so it was enough for everyone to know in their hearts. Because if one really wanted to be calculative, the 6 perfected lords of Zhengxianmeng and their forces, apart from perfected Lord Guangbua, all had their own businesses and income in private. It was just a matter of how much they earned. Otherwise, if everyone only waited for a little income from the great slaughterhouse every year, not to mention not having enough to eat and starve, wouldn't they have to depend on Immortal Guangbo for everything? At that time, Immortal Guangbo would replace Tianlan and become a thorn in everyone's side. As for Immortal Guangbo, there was no need for him to have any private property. His Dazayuan was in charge of Zhengxianmeng's wealth. There were too many opportunities for him to get involved. There was no need for him to do these things. That does make some sense. I've been dissatisfied with this injustice for a long time. However, Fuyunji is powerful now, what can we do? Immortal Tiehu said to Immortal Guangbo seriously. Immortal Guangbo leaned forward slightly and said in a low voice, I see that Tianlan has wild ambitions and is arrogant. Now that he has made a great contribution, if we don't restrain him, I'm afraid he will become the second devil cult in the future. Even though Immortal Tiehu had always been at odds with perfected Lord Tianlan, after hearing Immortal Guangbo's words, his expression changed slightly. He said in a low voice, Brother Guangbo, don't say such things. Immortal Guangbo didn't care at all. He looked at Immortal Tiehu and said, Brother Tiehu, you've always understood the ways of the world. You should know that what I said is true. Immortal Tiehu lowered his eyes and said after a while, if that's the case, what do you have to do? Immortal Guangbo said, for the sake of the world, you and I should join hands to do something so that justice can be reborn and righteousness can be restored. What do you think? Immortal Tiehu was silent for a while and said, this is a big matter. Let me think about it. Are you kidding me? Such a big matter can be decided with just a few words from you, Immortal Guangbo. Immortal Tiehu was very clear that although his subordinates from Heavenly Law Hall were not as valiant as Fuyunji's troops, their combat power was still very high in Zhengxianmeng. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that they were second only to Fuyunji. But what about Immortal Guangbo's great chancellery? That group of corrupt cultivators, from Immortal Guangbo to the ordinary cultivators of the great chancellery, lived a life of extreme luxury. They enjoyed their lives, but in terms of combat power, other than Immortal Guangbo, who was the leader of the deity transformation stage perfected lords, the others were simply a burden. The battle between the factions could not be settled by just a few deity transformation stage perfected lords. It would be very tiring to rely on these 2 or 3 people, let alone other things. Driving the tiger to swallow the wolf. Immortal Tiehu sneered in his heart, but on the surface, he also showed a hint of disapproval. Immortal Guangbo saw this. Although he was a little unhappy, he knew that his great chancellery had always given others an impression, so he could only swallow his anger. But since he had specially made this trip, it was impossible for him to be so simple and shallow. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been in charge of the great chancellery for so many years without falling. He smiled faintly and revealed a mysterious expression as he said, I understand Brother Taihu's worries. However, if I have a backup plan that can at least ensure that we have a 70% chance of winning against the Floating Clouds Company, what do you think? Immortal Tiehu and Song Wenji, who had been standing beside him and listening in silence, heard this, and their expressions changed at the same time. What backup plan could have such a big advantage against Immortal Tianlan's faction, which could almost be regarded as the #1 faction in the world? Song Wenji's gaze changed, and her chest rose and fell slightly. She looked a little nervous. Immortal Tiehu also stared at Immortal Guangbo for a long time, and then said in a deep voice, Is there such a thing? Brother Guangbo, please teach me. Immortal Guangbo met Immortal Tiehu's questioning gaze, and said lightly, No matter how strong Tianlan and Fuyunji are, they can't be more than 50% stronger than our Zhengxianmeng. In my opinion, they only account for 40% at most. If the rest of us... Immortal Tiehu instantly understood what he meant, and frowned. Have you looked for other people? Immortal Guangbo smiled and said, Guyu was humiliated by Tianlan a few days ago. He is old and has never suffered such humiliation. Yesterday, he quietly came to me. After that, he looked serious and said, If Brother Tiehu agrees, we can secretly form an alliance. At least 3 factions have a big advantage against Fuyunji. I will privately contact Golden Dragon and Flowing Cloud. They must be dissatisfied with Tianlan's arrogance. When they see that we are powerful, how can we not take action together? Immortal Tiehu's thoughts turned quickly, and after a while, he nodded and said, Brother Guangbo's words do make sense. This matter concerns the common people in the world, and justice. As the leaders of the righteous, we should rise up. This matter should be carried out quickly. Immortal Guangbo clapped his hands and laughed, and said, With Brother Tiehu's words, we will definitely succeed. He paused for a while, and then said, If so, I will immediately contact Golden Dragon and Flowing Cloud. We will meet privately in a few days to discuss the important matter. Immortal Tiehu smiled and said, We will rely on Brother Guangbo to take charge of the overall situation. Immortal Guangbo's face showed a hint of joy. Obviously, this was what he wanted to hear the most. He nodded repeatedly, and said a few more polite words, and then strode away. The moment he opened the door, a strong wind suddenly blew from outside the main hall, whistling through the towering Sky Dragon Peak, and the world was filled with killing intent. In the main hall, Song Wenji stood quietly, looking at Immortal Guangbo's receding figure with a thoughtful look on her face. Chapter 598. Lu Chen stood where he was, motionless for a long time. His surroundings were silent. There was no one in this underground cavern to begin with, only a red light. Behind him, the guards of the Floating Clouds Agency would definitely not come down without an order. So for a while, it was so quiet that it seemed like there was no life in this place, if there was no Atsu. Atsu was originally following behind Lu Chen. When Lu Chen suddenly stopped, it also stopped. At first, it did not notice Lu Chen's strange behavior. It just stood there casually, and at the same time, it looked at the city in the distance that was bathed in the strange dark red light of the blood moon. The light of the blood moon also fell on Atsu, who was standing next to Lu Chen. However, Atsu did not seem to have any reaction, at least it was not obvious at all. After waiting for a while, Atsu finally felt that something was wrong. It walked in front of Lu Chen and looked up at him. Lu Chen's face did not show any painful expression, but his brows were tightly knitted, as if he was thinking hard about something. However, he still could not find the answer he wanted, and his face gradually showed a blank expression. Atsu thought for a while, rubbed its head against Lu Chen's arm, and let out a low cry. Lu Chen's body trembled. From the countless complicated memories of the past that were like a maze, it seemed like a sudden clap of thunder had suddenly sounded in the sky, and it also seemed like a bolt of lightning had suddenly torn the darkness of the long night, illuminating the world in the shadow for a moment. He woke up with a start, and his face was pale. Then, he looked down and saw Atsu standing in front of him. Lu Chen was stunned for a moment. Suddenly, his chest rose and fell, and he looked a little excited. He took a few deep breaths, then walked up to Atsu, gently hugged its neck, and held it in his arms. Atsu was a little stunned. It did not know what happened to Lu Chen, but after so many years, it had already experienced countless life and death situations with Lu Chen. Soon, it felt that Lu Chen's emotions seemed to be not quite right. The man's body was slightly trembling, but he quickly calmed down. His arms were a little tense, as if he was trying to control his emotions, or like a person who was too cold and yearning for warmth. Fortunately, Atsu's body was warm. Its body temperature warmed Lu Chen's chest, and his slightly cold blood flowed again. Atsu stood there quietly. Occasionally, it would whimper, but it didn't make any move to break free. It just stayed by Lu Chen's side, using its body heat to warm him up. It even rubbed his face gently, trying to comfort him. This was the first time in many years that this black dog saw Lu Chen show such a weak moment. After an unknown amount of time, Lu Chen's body and emotions had calmed down. When he raised his head from Atsu again, the weak look had disappeared. He had once again become the strong and calm man who seemed to be wearing a thick layer of hard armor. "I'm fine." Lu Chen patted Atsu's head and said softly. Atsu tilted its head slightly and looked at Lu Chen, as if it did not quite believe him. Lu Chen sighed. He did not intend to explain in detail to a dog. After a moment of silence, he turned around and walked back the way he came, which was the passage. Atsu was a little surprised. They had just come down to the underground cave, and they had just walked to the edge. They had not even gotten close to the underground city, and now they were leaving. Lu Chen's face was expressionless. Perhaps he was in a bad mood. He was really not in the mood to search for White Lotus's whereabouts in this large, empty, hell-like city below. Moreover, even if he went to look for her, he might not be able to find her. However, after he took a few steps, Atsu barked twice behind him. It sounded a little strange, and there was a hint of dissatisfaction in it. It seemed like even a dog had its own pride. Atsu was a little dissatisfied after being dragged along for a walk for nothing. Lu Chen sighed, but he also knew that his behavior was strange. He turned around with a wry smile and said to Atsu, "Atsu, I have encountered a problem now. It's quite troublesome." White Lotus, when he was trying to explain to Atsu, when the two words White Lotus came out of his mouth, White Lotus's figure naturally flashed across his mind, and he thought of White Lotus's appearance. His voice suddenly stopped, and he suddenly frowned. In his memory, that beautiful girl seemed to always be a two-faced person. On one side, she was a vicious and ruthless girl with bloody hands, and on the other side, she was a beautiful and refined gentle girl. It was just that at this moment, the two completely different appearances of that girl seemed to suddenly merge into one, becoming a new and familiar person. And that face seemed to vaguely overlap with a distant and blurry face in the deepest part of his memory. "White Lotus, Lu Chen murmured again, and he even shook his head, as if he wanted to get rid of the strange emotions and thoughts in his mind. But his voice finally stopped again, and this time, he completely fell into silence. Atsu was a little confused by Lu Chen. It felt that it had followed Lu Chen for so many years, but it had never seen Lu Chen acting so strange like today. Its eyes rolled a few times, and then it looked up at the high ceiling of the grotto, where the blood moon was shrouded in dark red light. It felt that Lu Chen had been harmed by the blood moon. Was he bewitched? Had he lost his mind? Had he become stupid? Atsu suddenly became a little angry, and it roared at the blood moon in the sky. It roared angrily, and it looked very fierce. But the blood moon in the sky didn't respond to it, as if it didn't care, and it didn't seem to understand this black dog's inexplicable anger. At this time, suddenly, a hand reached out from behind. It was Lu Chen who walked to Atsu's side. He gently stroked the soft and smooth fur of Atsu, and after a moment of silence, he said, "Let's go down. We still have to do what we have to do. Go and find White Lotus." With that said, Lu Chen strode forward. Atsu was stunned for a moment. It thought to itself, this person isn't an ordinary fickle person today. It stood on the spot and wagged its tail, but Atu still trotted after him. The quiet underground city, in the red blood light, was like a sleeping giant beast, or a completely dead skeleton. Lu Chen and Atsu, a man and a dog, walked slowly on the street. The doors were wide open, and there seemed to be some kind of strange eyes hidden in them, staring at them. In the quiet space, perhaps there was a terrible voice screaming, calling, and shouting, as if it wanted to drag them down into the abyss to accompany those dead souls. Unknowingly, they walked near the statue, but they didn't find anything unusual along the way. Just as Lu Chen was considering whether to use the stupidest method to start searching nearby, there seemed to be some kind of power here that was responding to the blood moon in the sky. Suddenly, there was a soft but sad cry from a corner of this city. It seemed to be the sad cry of a young girl, and it floated in the air, as if it had crossed many years, returned to this world from the depths of her memory, and came to Lu Chen's side. Lu Chen suddenly turned around, and looked at the swaying and changing blood shadow in the distance. The long street was silent, and there was no one, but at the same time, there seemed to be a strange fog quietly spreading from the street. Chapter 599. His voice was filled with resentment and sorrow. It sounded as if he had suffered the greatest pain in the world, or as if he had a very sad story in his heart and was crying alone in this city. Lu Chen heard the voice, and at the same time, he also saw the mist that suddenly floated up. Most of the mist in the world was white, but here, perhaps because of the light of the blood moon in the sky above, the mist below became a faint red airflow, slowly flowing on the roads, houses, and every corner of this mysterious city. From a distance, it looked like a blood-colored stream, quietly spreading. Atu took a step forward and called out to the thin mist. He looked a little wary, but he didn't seem to be too afraid. Lu Chen's expression was a little solemn. He stared at the red mist that was floating and spreading, and at the same time, listened carefully to the woman's crying voice that floated in this catacomb city. The voice sounded a little erratic, sometimes near and sometimes far, as if separated by a high wall, causing the tone of the voice to change. Therefore, although Lu Chen had some doubts in his heart, he still could not conclude that this voice was the white lotus he was looking for. In addition, Lu Chen also became vigilant in his heart. He had come to this underground city many times. Although the sky was full of red light from the blood moon hanging over his head, and the city was empty, although it looked very strange everywhere, this was the first time such an anomaly had happened. To be precise, it was the first time that the people of Starry Temple had been messing around in this underground city for a long time. No one knew what kind of strange prohibition or formation they had set up in this place. The red mist was slowly approaching, but after listening carefully for a long time, Lu Chen still could not identify the specific source of the sound. After a moment of silence, he gently patted Atsu who was standing next to him and whispered, "Can you find the place where the sound came from?" Atu raised his head to look at the sky, but he did not intend to listen carefully. Instead, he used his nose to sniff the air a few times. After a moment, he seemed to take a hesitant step forward, and then he stopped. He seemed to be carefully distinguishing, and it was rather difficult. Lu Chen did not urge it, but just frowned slightly and looked around. Atsu began to walk and stop, and did not continue to move forward. Instead, it began to circle around the huge statue in the center of the city. It took a few steps forward and sniffed. Just like that, it leisurely circled around the area. Seeing that the red mist was gradually approaching them, and when it was only about 100 feet away from them, Atu suddenly stopped and walked in a certain direction. Lu Chen raised his head and glanced in that direction. He found that the direction Atsu was walking in was a house that did not look much different from the surrounding. The tall door was open, and it was quiet and empty inside. There was already a little red mist in some corners. There were a few stone steps, and the threshold was above the knees. After walking to the door and looking at the house a few times, Lu Chen once again confirmed that the house here looked almost exactly the same, except for the various sizes that were slightly larger than the normal houses in the human world. So, who would have lived here originally? Obviously, Atsu was not interested in this kind of question. It took a few steps forward, first jumped over the threshold, and ran into the courtyard of the house. Then, it raised its head and sniffed a few times, then stared at the direction of the house's backyard and ran there. Lu Chen followed behind Atsu with a cold expression. He glanced around and could clearly feel the smell of blood drifting from that direction. He snorted, and his eyes slowly lit up with a dark flame. His clothes fluttered even though there was no wind, and he slowly walked over. The woman's crying voice suddenly became louder and clearer, as if it was somewhere in front of him. And in Lu Chen's ears, he seemed to feel that the voice gradually became a little familiar. Even the originally vague crying voice seemed to have a few more words. Although most of it was still a little vague, he could hear a few words clearly. Blood. Acacia. Flower. Ah, Lu Chen's face suddenly sank. He remembered that he had heard this song before. It was on a certain night in Kunlun Mountain, when he was still living in the thatched hut on the cliff outside Su Qingjuan's cave residence. White Lotus came late at night, sat on his window sill, shook her feet, looked up at the sky, and softly sang that ballad. Suddenly, the depths of his heart twitched, as if a cold knife had suddenly stabbed into it. The piercing pain was suffocating. Roar! In front of him, Atsu suddenly roared in a low voice, and its voice suddenly carried a violent aura. Almost at the same time, Lu Chen also felt that the smell of blood suddenly became 10 times stronger. His eyes flashed, and almost without thinking, his body suddenly swept forward, like a lightning bolt. A smear of red light suddenly flashed past, like a bloodthirsty beast pouncing over. Lu Chen's body slightly bent, the black fire on his body instantly flourished, directly turned into a black sword edge and slashed over. The wind whistled, incomparably mournful. That blood light in the air was split apart by the black fire, and emitted a terrifying, zzz, sound, and then a miserable cry was heard. A person submerged in blood, even his face could not be seen clearly, staggered backwards, but that terrible black fire, like a demon, did not have the slightest intention of letting him go. It directly bit him, surrounded him, and then violently burned him. Lu Chen landed in the air, his body shook greatly, retreated a few steps back, his face also turned pale. The blood man's power was unusually great, even with his current skills, he could not withstand it, even his chest felt a pain, almost spurting out a mouthful of blood. However, Lu Chen still endured it. He turned his eyes over. Although the bloody man seemed powerful, for some reason, he didn't feel any anger coming from him. Yes, he did not even feel that it was a living person. Blood flowed unceasingly from that blood man's body, like a small river, and looked endless. It was unknown how much blood this person had in his body. A violent aura emanated from his body, but also contained a feeling of weakness and despair. At the same time, the black fire wrapped around the blood man's body. The blood man clearly could not do anything about it. The black fire burned fiercely, and then desperately drilled into the blood man's body. In that instant, Lu Chen thought of many years ago, when he was entangled by the black fire. He was in a desperate situation worse than death, and that indescribable pain. Then, he heard that hoarse howl, as if it came from the deepest part of the soul. Lu Chen took 2 steps back, although the blood man in front of him was abnormally powerful, but at this moment, Lu Chen already felt that this monster seemed to have completely lost consciousness. He turned his head to the side, and then his expression suddenly stiffened. He saw White Lotus. Chapter 600. From the moment he rushed into the backyard from the front yard, he was immediately attacked by this strange blood man. It could be said that it was only at this moment that Lu Chen properly observed the situation around him for the first time. Everywhere he looked, everything was bright red. Perhaps it was the curse of the blood moon in the sky. Wherever the blood light shone, the disaster of blood light was inevitable. And this once peaceful backyard was now completely smeared with blood. The scene was unusually mournful, glaring, and soul-stirring. If a timid ordinary person saw this, it was likely that he would faint on the spot. But Lu Chen was not an ordinary person. He had seen countless terrifying scenes in his life, so he was almost not affected by the mournful scene at all. Instead, he instantly judged that the seemingly messy and cruel blood smeared everywhere in the yard seemed to be a battle formation. Moreover, it was somewhat familiar, as if he had seen it somewhere before. Then he saw that in the midst of the blood formation, somewhere in the backyard, there seemed to be a place that looked like a well. Of course, at this moment, the well was almost completely covered in blood. But at the edge of the well, in the dripping blood, at this moment, sat a person. She looked petite, and her body was also covered in blood. But unlike the blood man, her head was exposed, and very strangely, it was not stained with any blood. The area below her neck seemed to be smeared with a layer of blood. Her face was that of a white lotus. At a glance, she looked like a young girl wearing a bright red dress. At this moment, she sat in a pool of blood with her eyes closed. Her brows were also furrowed, and there was a faint expression of pain on her face. From time to time, her face would twitch, but for some reason, she did not say a word, as if she was forcibly enduring it. Lu Chen was startled. Just as he was about to walk forward, his heart suddenly moved. Suddenly, a thought seemed to suddenly flash through his mind, but he did not grasp it. He only faintly felt that he seemed to have missed something. The scene in front of him was tragic, terrifying, and strange, but there seemed to be something not quite right. He stood where he was for a moment, and then he saw that in the blood formation that was smeared on the ground, although there were many concealments or messy bloodstains to cover up, the main part was still the blood-feeding, secret technique that he saw White Lotus once set up. White Lotus, who was able to set up such a vicious and sinister array, was certainly not a pushover. However, everything in front of him still made Lu Chen suck in a breath of cold air. Even when he was still in the devil cult, he had never seen an array of such a scale and abnormally strong spiritual power. He realized that he seemed to have underestimated White Lotus. Roar! A roar came from the side, pulling Lu Chen's gaze away from White Lotus. He looked back and saw Atsu standing at the edge of the blood-feeding secret array, roaring at the bloody man who was being burned by the black fire. Lu Chen was a little worried. He took 2 steps towards Atsu. In the hasty battle just now, although the bloody man was in an abnormally strange state and seemed to be unconscious, his strength was unusually strong. It could be said that he was not inferior to an ordinary Yuanying stage Shinran. He was really a very dangerous person. Atsu had now become very powerful, but in the face of such a mysterious and strange enemy, Lu Chen was still a little worried. But soon, Lu Chen discovered that the bloody man did not attack Atsu. Even though Atsu was roaring at him and exuding obvious hostility, the bloody man was swaying his body frantically and shouting in a messy voice. The black fire was burning on his body. Was he blinded by the terrible pain? Lu Chen hesitated for a moment and called out to Atsu. Atsu turned his head and looked at him, then gave up the confrontation with the bloody man and ran over. However, his eyes still looked back at the bloody man from time to time. Obviously, he was very vigilant against this great enemy. The bloody man did not respond to the actions of Lu Chen and Atsu. His voice was slowly fading away, and his body was half limp, as if he was kneeling on the ground. Lu Chen frowned and looked at the extremely strange bloody man. The wind with a strong smell of blood blew through the underground cave with some whimpers, as if it was a sad cry from ancient times. Lu Chen turned around and strode towards White Lotus. His footsteps stepped on the bloodstains on the ground, leaving 2 lines of footprints stained with blood. Not long after, he came to White Lotus's side, but when he squatted in front of White Lotus, for a moment, he did not know how to start. This girl's body was covered with blood from the neck down. Lu Chen did not know why, but looking at White Lotus's expression, although there was a bit of pain, her spirit was still passable. Lu Chen whispered to White Lotus twice, but White Lotus did not respond, as if she could not hear him. Lu Chen hesitated for a moment, then stretched out his hand and gently patted White Lotus's cheek. As expected, White Lotus reacted. Her body suddenly trembled, but for some reason, her eyes still did not open. Instead, her eyelids twitched a few times, and her lips were tightly pursed and trembling, but she still did not open her eyes, nor did she open her mouth to speak. Lu Chen's heart skipped a beat. White Lotus's reaction was both good and bad. The good thing was that she seemed to still be conscious and responded to external stimuli. The bad thing was that she seemed to be imprisoned by some strange method, unable to open her eyes, and unable to speak. Atsu walked over with Lu Chen. It was obvious that it did not like the surrounding blood-feeding secret spell formation. It looked left and right with a fierce look in its eyes. Even when it looked up at White Lotus, there was no good look in its eyes. It seemed that if it could, it would probably be very willing to go up and bite this girl's beautiful face. At the same time, it would growl from its mouth from time to time. Lu Chen also ignored Atsu. After a moment of silence, he directly reached out and hugged her, ignoring the layer of blood on White Lotus's body. With a low sound, he carried her directly. However, when his hands came into contact with Bai Lian's body, he suddenly frowned and his expression darkened. The layer of blood was too eye-catching, even Lu Chen's eyes were deceived, or it could be said that he did not notice other parts of White Lotus's body. Until this time, when he carried her, he found that White Lotus was not wearing any clothes. This girl was actually sitting naked in this strange spell formation. Lu Chen's face became a little gloomy. Without much hesitation, he directly reached into his arms. After a moment, a faint light flashed, and there was already a cloak in his hand. Then with a shake of his hand, the cloak unfolded, and directly wrapped White Lotus in it. Then he turned his head and took a look, only to see that the bloody person had completely fallen into the pool of blood on the ground under the burning black fire. It was motionless, and it seemed that it was no longer alive. Lu Chen glanced at White Lotus in his arms, only to see that her eyes were still closed, and it seemed that she was still trapped in that inexplicable mysterious enchantment. He did not dare to hesitate anymore, and strode out. He walked all the way to the door of this big house. The moment he was about to step over the threshold, his heart suddenly moved, but he thought of a place that he seemed to have overlooked just now. White Lotus seemed to have been restrained. So just now, that blurry and strange singing voice in the thin mist, who was it that was singing? Chapter 601. Lu Chen stopped in place and looked down at White Lotus in his arms with some confusion. At this moment, her body was wrapped in the cloak, covering the bright red blood on her body. She didn't look so strange and mournful anymore. Perhaps it was because of the warmth in Lu Chen's arms. White Lotus's expression calmed down at this moment. The original pain on her face lessened a lot, and her eyebrows relaxed. She seemed to know that she was safe and had escaped from the sea of suffering and danger. However, her pair of eyes still hadn't opened until now. It seemed that there was still some kind of restriction on her. Lu Chen's heart slightly moved. The hands that were holding her body slightly tightened, and he carefully used his spiritual power to explore her body. Almost at the moment when his spiritual power entered White Lotus's meridians, Lu Chen suddenly felt an incomparably violent spiritual power like a crazy beast rushing over, crushing his spiritual power in an instant. At the same time, Lu Chen clearly felt that this violent spiritual power from the depths of White Lotus's body was also tearing her meridians, and fragmented scars could be seen everywhere. If this continued, there was no need for others to do anything. As long as White Lotus dragged on for a while, her meridians would be broken and she would die without a doubt. Lu Chen was shocked. He didn't think that White Lotus, who didn't seem to have any injuries on the outside, would have her meridians eroded to such an extent. Just what happened when she was missing? Lu Chen didn't dare to delay any longer. Of course, the most important thing was to leave this place and think of a way to save White Lotus. When he stepped out of the door, he looked at the street in front of him. He found that the strange fog that had just appeared had dissipated at some point. Could it be that the strange thing that happened here was related to the strange bloody man just now? Lu Chen hesitated for a moment. He wanted to go back and check what was wrong with the bloody man. But at this moment, White Lotus suddenly let out a low moan. Her face showed a painful expression again, and at the same time, blood slowly flowed down from the corner of her mouth. Lu Chen was taken aback. He knew that White Lotus's internal injuries were extremely serious and couldn't be delayed any longer. He could only grit his teeth and immediately ran toward the exit of this underground cave. After running a few steps, Lu Chen suddenly realized that Atsu didn't follow him. It seemed that they still stayed in the big house. He couldn't help but frown. He turned back and shouted at the house, "Atsu, go!" In the backyard of the big house, in the tragic scene that was wrapped in the smell of blood, Atsu was indeed still here. It didn't leave this place with Lu Chen. It was probably because when it was about to leave, it sniffed the air with its nose and seemed to have suddenly sensed something. It slowly walked all the way to the bloody man who had fallen to the ground and was on the verge of death from the black fire, but was still submerged in a pool of blood. It didn't step into the pool of blood. Instead, it stood there about 5 or 6 feet away. There seemed to be some doubt in its eyes. It stared at the bloody man for a long time. It wasn't until Lu Chen's shout came from outside the house that Atsu shuddered and seemed to come to his senses. He whimpered a couple of times before turning around and walking out. However, when it was about to leave this courtyard, suddenly, in this already quiet courtyard, amidst the bloody stench and terrifying bloodstains, a low, indistinct, yet seemingly distant singing suddenly sounded. Crescent moon, seeing Albizia, red, for, ya, time passes like water, white hair flutters, towards, the song was intermittent, the pronunciation was unclear, and there were often missing words in the middle. Ordinary people couldn't understand it, let alone a black dog. Atsu looked more and more confused. It looked back at the bloody man, but the bloody man fell to the ground. He didn't get up, nor did he move. His whole body was covered in blood, and it couldn't be seen if this monster was singing or not. Atsu looked left, right, and up and down at the sky. All he saw was a sea of blood, but there was not a shadow of a human. Not even the legendary ghosts who would play tricks in such a tragic scene could be seen. The situation looked a little strange. Atsu took a step back, feeling a little creeped out, feeling a little scared, suddenly barked loudly, as if trying to boost his courage, turned around abruptly and dashed out of the courtyard like a wisp of smoke. A cold wind blew, and the courtyard that was covered in blood finally fell into complete silence. There was a hint of desolation. The smell of blood still permeated the air. The bloody man on the ground was bleeding, and the black fire burned for a long time before it was finally extinguished. After an unknown period of time, there seemed to be a finger-like thing moving slightly on the remains of the body in the pool of blood. When Lu Chen was about to run to the exit of the underground cave, he heard a rush of footsteps behind him. He was very familiar with the pace. After all, it was the dog that had been by his side for so many years. He didn't look back. His hands hugged White Lotus and he walked forward quickly. At the same time, he said, "Why did you stay in that place just now? It was weird, and there might be danger. Remember to follow me closely next time." Atsu responded with a woof. It raised its head and looked at Lu Chen, then looked at White Lotus in his arms. Then, it quickly ran ahead of them. When Lu Chen rushed out of the tunnel with White Lotus in his arms, the guards of the Floating Clouds Department, led by Lu Ting, all came over. However, when they saw Lu Chen's appearance and the person he was carrying in his arms, even though White Lotus's face was covered by the cloak, all of them were instantly dumbfounded. A few of them even cried out involuntarily, What's going on?" When Lu Chen went down, everyone saw clearly that there was only one person and one dog. There was absolutely no other person. As for White Lotus, although she wasn't a popular person, her identity and status were not to be underestimated. When she was suddenly carried out of the tunnel by Lu Chen, whether she was alive or dead, everyone's first reaction was that they were in trouble. Not to mention anything else, just the fact that White Lotus had somehow managed to sneak into the underground cavern was a dereliction of duty on all of their part. Now, this person looked completely unconscious, and there were even a few drops of blood dripping from the cloak. When the guards saw this, their scalps went numb and their mouths tasted bitter. Lu Ting was dumbstruck. After being pushed by one of his subordinates who reacted quickly, he suddenly came to his senses. He hurriedly ran over to Lu Chen and asked anxiously, "Young master, what's going on?" Lu Chen wasn't in the mood to explain, but he knew Lu Ting's current predicament and worry. He immediately said decisively, I discovered that White Lotus was heavily injured. This shouldn't be your fault. I'll bring her back to treat her injuries first. I'll explain it to Master and your hall mistress Shuang later. Lu Ting's heart immediately relaxed, and the expression on his face also relaxed. He hurriedly waved his hand and said to the people behind him, Get out of the way, get out of the way. Didn't you hear what young master said? Saving her is more important. But if Lu Chen hadn't taken responsibility just now, Lu Ting probably wouldn't have dared to let White Lotus go. Lu Chen nodded to him and immediately flew off, heading straight for Kunlun Palace. But when he saw the towering eaves of Kunlun Palace, a thought suddenly flashed through his mind, causing him to subconsciously stop in his tracks. White Lotus's internal injuries were strange and incomparably serious. If she was given to true Lord Tianlan to treat her injuries, would he take advantage of this rare opportunity to directly kill her? No matter how he looked at it, this was a great opportunity that no one would be aware of. Even if others were to suspect something, they would probably only suspect Lu Chen himself. Lu Chen frowned and began to hesitate. Chapter 602. Lu Chen was in a dilemma. In the past, his relationship with White Lotus could only be said to be ordinary. Although they had known each other for a long time, they were definitely not close. However, he did not want White Lotus to die inexplicably. Otherwise, why did he have to go to the underground cave and rescue her? However, it was a very difficult choice at the moment. White Lotus looked fine on the outside, but the spiritual power in her body was very violent and abnormal. It was very likely that she would lose control at any time, and this beautiful and talented girl would be blown to pieces. However, could it be that Lord Tianlan also saw that she was so talented and had other thoughts in his heart? After all, she was still the last disciple of Hakushin Jinkuan. That moment was not long, and White Lotus could not afford to delay it. However, in Lu Chen's heart, it seemed to suddenly be tormented by a dilemma for a long time. But in the end, he finally shook his head, sighed, and whispered to himself, Forget it, anyway, it's not the first time I've been a scapegoat. If I want to be a scapegoat, then let me be. He no longer hesitated, and strode towards the Kunlun temple. Atsu ran behind him, and suddenly its eyes lit up. It saw that under the big pillar outside the Kunlun temple, Oxen was lying there, and seemed to be lazily basking in the sun and dozing off. Atsu barked excitedly, and sped up its pace towards Oxen. Of course, it was different from Lu Chen. It was not worried about White Lotus's injury at all. Probably in the mind of this black dog, even if White Lotus died, it would not be sad at all. If White Lotus woke up at this moment and saw this scene, she would probably be half dead from anger. Earlier at the horse-washing bridge at the foot of the mountain, she had also gotten a lot of demon beast meat to feed this black dog, but it seemed that it was all for nothing. Oxen felt it very quickly. It raised its head and looked over. It saw the black dog running to its side, wagging its tail and growling in a low voice. It seemed very happy. Oxen's attitude towards Atsu was much better now. It swung its tail and let out a moo sound, not sure if it was a greeting or not. However, when it turned to look at Lu Chen, especially when it saw Lu Chen holding the unconscious White Lotus in his arms, Oxen seemed to be stunned for a moment before it stood up. Lu Chen walked to the outside of the hall and looked inside. He did not see Supreme Lord Tianlan in the hall. After frowning, he said to Oxen, Where's the damn Baldy? I need him to save someone. It's urgent. Oxen hesitated for a moment, turned around and walked into the hall, then all the way to the back hall. Lu Chen looked at its back and thought for a moment. Then, he walked into the hall with White Lotus in his arms. He found a quiet place with no wind and carefully put her down. It was very quiet. Atsu seemed to have stayed outside. It seemed that since the last time they came here, Atsu did not like to enter this hall anymore. That dog was very smart. Lu Chen held White Lotus's palm and calmed his mind. Then, he carefully inserted his spiritual power into White Lotus's body again and began to check on her injuries. The violent spiritual power in White Lotus's body was still extremely fierce, but Lu Chen had learned from the previous mistake. This time, he was very careful to hide in a corner of her meridians, so he persisted a little longer. Taking advantage of this opportunity, he carefully felt the situation in White Lotus's body. Then, his expression became a little strange. The violent spiritual power that suddenly appeared in this girl's body was extremely powerful. Everywhere it passed, it was fierce and violent. Even White Lotus's meridians could not withstand this power. This was the first time Lu Chen had seen such a strange phenomenon in so many years of cultivation. In the past, he had never seen such a strange thing. Because it looked like the spiritual power did not seem to be White Lotus's own spiritual power. With her cultivation realm, her body contained such a powerful spiritual power. It seemed to be very similar to the ancient saying, "A snake swallows an elephant." Lu Chen did not know where this power came from, nor did he know what happened to White Lotus's body. But looking at the injuries in her meridians, she should not be able to hold on for long. Lu Chen quickly pondered in his heart. He thought of all the possible ways he could save her. Finally, he came to a conclusion, and that was, he really seemed to have a way to save her. That was to use the black fire to inject into White Lotus's meridians. Of course, the spiritual power in White Lotus's body was abnormally violent and powerful. It was not suitable to face it head-on. So, Lu Chen would try to burn and slow down this spiritual power from the side. As long as enough time passed, he might be able to slowly grind down this spiritual power. At least, it would not be so violent. But the price of doing this was that White Lotus's meridians would be completely destroyed. Being ravaged by the violent spiritual power and being burned by the black fire, even if she was a genius of the 5 pillars, she would become a useless person. A useless person or a dead person, which ending was better? Perhaps there was no difference. Lu Chen did not know. At this moment, he could not ask White Lotus for her opinion. Fortunately, he did not dwell on this problem for too long. Soon, footsteps were heard in the hall. The footsteps of a man and a cow walked over together. It seemed that perfected Lord Tianlan was resting at the back of the Kunlun Hall today and was invited by oxen. However, probably only oxen could be so direct and unscrupulous. Ordinary disciples never dared to disturb perfected Lord Tianlan when he was resting. Perfected Lord Tianlan, who was wearing a loose robe, strode over with bright eyes. He did not say anything to Lu Chen. He just glanced at him and then swept his gaze over White Lotus, who was lying on the ground. Afterwards, he furrowed his brows and walked over. He crouched down next to White Lotus and first held White Lotus' chin in his hand. He gently shook it left and right as he looked at it. After a moment of silence, he pulled up his cloak. Lu Chen stood aside in silence. Perfected Lord Tianlan pulled up his cloak halfway and suddenly stopped. Obviously, he had seen the situation under the cloak. Perfected Lord Tianlan was silent for a moment. Then, he slowly covered the girl with the cloak again and said in a deep voice, "What happened?" Lu Chen used the simplest and most direct words to tell him about this matter, including the strange and extremely dangerous anomaly in White Lotus's body. Perfected Lord Tianlan's face darkened slightly. He suddenly stretched out his hand. However, he did not hold White Lotus's fingertips like Lu Chen did. Instead, he directly pressed his hand on White Lotus's forehead. At that moment, Lu Chen seemed to hear the air suddenly tense and there was a faint tearing sound of electric currents. However, everything was still quiet. Suddenly, an inexplicable wind blew past perfected Lord Tianlan and lifted a corner of his loose robe. A blue brick under his feet cracked and turned into powder. Perfected Lord Tianlan's expression did not change. He pressed his palm on White Lotus's forehead and looked a little cold. After a moment, he said in a low voice, "A snake swallows an elephant." After saying these 3 words, a murderous look suddenly flashed across his face. The murderous look was so obvious that Lu Chen felt it almost instantly. He could even feel that the damn Baldy did not intend to hide it at all. He just revealed it so blatantly. Then, he heard Perfected Lord Tianlan suddenly turn to him and ask, "Does White Lotus know the blood food secret method?" Chapter 603. Supreme Tianlan looked at Lu Chen without any strong hostility. That cold murderous intent was not directed at him. Lu Chen could feel this. At the same time, he also understood why Supreme Tianlan would have such an emotion. The blood food secret skill was not a very honorable Taoist skill. Its origin was mysterious, when it was formed was not known, but basically it was thought to be inextricably linked to the evil cult and the ancient witchcraft of the southern wilderness barbarian tribes. Even for a long time, there were people in the human race cultivation world who suspected that this sinister and evil skill might be the result of the cross between these two kinds of evil skills. Supreme Tianlan was the leader of the good faction in the world and even had the prestige of being the world's #1 person. He certainly did not have a good impression of this kind of skill that was related to the evil cult. Lu Chen was well aware of this, and he also knew that if he let nature take its course, it might not necessarily be a bad choice. Perhaps he would have done so in the first place. After all, after so many years of tempering, silence and patience had long since become his habit. But in the end, for some reason, he still opened his mouth and said, "She knows the blood food's secret skill," but, he paused and then calmly said, "I have been in the evil cult for 10 years and almost never seen anyone use this evil skill. I think it should be more related to the barbarian witchcraft of the southern wilderness barbarian." Supreme Tianlan's eyes slightly narrowed. The way he looked at Lu Chen seemed to have changed, but Lu Chen met his gaze and did not have any intention to avoid it. After a while, Supreme Tianlan suddenly sneered and said, "Then you mean, she is actually a southern wilderness barbarian?" "No." Lu Chen immediately shook his head and said, "I don't know how she actually practiced this evil skill, but she is definitely not a barbarian." Supreme Tianlan nodded, looked down at White Lotus and said, "There is actually such a monster in the underground cave. It seems that we need to go and have a look." While speaking, he looked at Lu Chen and lightly said, "Come with me later." "Okay." Lu Chen agreed. Perfected Lord Tianlan kept his hands in his wide sleeves and paced back and forth for a while before suddenly asking, "Although her injuries are strange and dangerous, I should be able to save her." Lu Chen's heart skipped a beat, but there was no joy on his face. Instead, his heart sank, but his face was calm as usual, and he only nodded. Indeed, Perfected Lord Tianlan turned around and looked at him with a smile. "Then, do you think I should save her?" Lu Chen took a deep breath and said, "You asked me to bring her back, and I did it. As for whether or not to save her, I can't make the decision. It's up to you." Perfected Lord Tianlan stared at him for a moment before nodding. "All right, let's not save him then. It'll save us some trouble." As soon as he finished speaking, he waved his sleeve and turned around. Just like that, he walked all the way into the rear hall and didn't look back even once. Lu Chen silently watched Perfected Lord Tianlan's back as he left. For a moment, he was also speechless. When that imposing figure disappeared from the hall, he lowered his head to look at White Lotus on the ground. The cloak was still covering her body. Although it covered her originally beautiful body that was now covered in blood, some of the blood still slowly flowed out and dyed the surrounding bricks red. White Lotus was still unconscious. At least her eyes were tightly shut and there was no sign of her waking up. Lu Chen looked at her beautiful face with an unusually complicated expression. After a while, he bent down and hugged the girl's body again. Perhaps because she was pressed against his chest, White Lotus once again felt that familiar warmth. She moved her body and pressed closer to him. Then, Lu Chen heard her seemingly unconsciously murmur a few words. The voice was very vague and indistinct. Lu Chen listened carefully, but White Lotus didn't continue to speak. After waiting for a while, he had to carry her out of the Kunlun Hall. Atsu was still waiting outside the door. When he saw him come out, he quickly ran over. Lu Chen thought for a while and stepped forward. Atsu looked at him with a somewhat strange expression and then looked at White Lotus in his arms. He didn't seem to understand Lu Chen's actions, but he still followed him in the end. Lu Chen carried White Lotus all the way to the room where Su Qingjun used to live. He pushed the door open and put White Lotus on the bed. Then he asked Atsu to stay at the door. Before he closed the door, he said to Atsu, "Don't let anyone else in." Atsu barked and lay at the door. Lu Chen patted its head and then closed the door. The room suddenly became quiet. It was so quiet that it was somewhat lifeless. However, the strong smell of blood from White Lotus's body made this place feel a little different. At least, it was not so rigid. Lu Chen walked to the edge of the bed and silently looked at White Lotus. After a while, he suddenly said, "There's so much blood on you. You've dirted her bed. I'm afraid that when she comes back, she won't use this bed anymore." White Lotus didn't say anything. It seemed that she couldn't hear his words in her coma, or even if she heard it, she couldn't make any response. Lu Chen didn't say anything. He just frowned and sat down on the edge of the bed. After a moment of hesitation, he grabbed one of White Lotus's soft hands and held it tightly. "Tell me, should I take the risk to save you?" Lu Chen asked White Lotus. Judging from his expression, it seemed that White Lotus would give him an answer. Moo, oxen let out a low moan. It chewed the elixir it got from somewhere unhurriedly. Not far from it, perfected Lord Tianlan walked over. After glancing at it, he said lightly, "I didn't save her." Oxen didn't respond. Perfected Lord Tianlan also didn't say anything. He just put his hands behind his back and looked up at the sky. After a while, he suddenly sneered and said, "A snake swallowing an elephant? She's so young, but she's really ambitious." This time, the green ox paused for a moment and looked up at Perfected Lord Tianlan. Perfected Lord Tianlan waved his hand and said, "There's no need to be a busybody. My senior brother's legacy has been severed. There's nothing to feel pity about. Besides, she still has 2 senior brothers on Kunlun Mountain. Although they didn't inherit the Snow Wind scripture, at least they have the status." After a pause, a trace of dissatisfaction flashed across his eyebrows. He said, "But Lu Chen should know what I'm thinking. Why didn't he just kill this woman in the cave and bring back her corpse?" The green ox snorted and mooed. It turned around, as if it was a little disdainful. After a moment of silence, Perfected Lord Tianlan suddenly sighed and nodded. "That's right. You and Master always feel that I'm too murderous. Lu Chen is different from me. Perhaps he has his own merits." He seemed to lose interest and turned to leave while shaking his head. However, he had only taken a few steps when he suddenly sensed something and looked up at the sky again. A ray of bright light shone down from the sky. In an instant, the sea of blood and dark clouds that filled the sky dispersed, and the sky became bright again. The terrifying and gloomy phenomenon quickly disappeared, and the sky became clear again. Perfected Lord Tianlan grinned and muttered to himself, Soon. There's only one more time." Chapter 604. His memories were still a bit chaotic. That sudden sense of emptiness still lingered in Lu Chen's heart, making him feel somewhat fearful and uneasy. In fact, if it was a complete emptiness, it would be like sleeping soundly at night, completely unaware of what had happened outside in the dead of night. Of course, there was nothing to be upset about. But in Lu Chen's heart, there was always an inexplicable shadow swaying back and forth in his heart. He tried his best to recall what had happened in that blank period of time, but he just couldn't remember it. Yet there were 1 or 2 jumping-off effects that kept flashing through his mind. He didn't know what the meaning of those inexplicable and strange, or perhaps it could be said that everything was blurry, or perhaps it was all his own hallucinations and overthinking. But in his heart, there was always a voice that he couldn't get rid of. It made his hair stand on end, made him break out in cold sweat, made him continuously search for the past, always returning without any results, but he still couldn't give up. That mournful and angry roar seemed to always echo in his mind. That voice's origins were unfathomable, perhaps he had never heard these words in his life, but it seemed to be engraved in the deepest part of his heart, never leaving. Those words were like a knife, coldly illuminating the darkest depths of his heart. That voice shouted, "You actually killed even her, N." A low groan, containing a trace of pain, echoed in Lu Chen's ears. Lu Chen's body trembled, and then he woke up from his imagination and endless bewilderment. He shook his head, feeling helpless towards that almost completely blank and blurry memory. His hand was still holding White Lotus's palm. Probably because he had rubbed and carried her several times, the smell of blood on White Lotus's body had already weakened a lot, and the blood that was originally dripping had also gradually dried up, no longer flowing wantonly. Correspondingly, Lu Chen's cloak seemed to be completely dyed red. Lu Chen composed himself, thinking back to that terrifying conjecture he had just made. For some reason, he actually shivered. For a man with a strong will like him, this was quite rare. But when he looked at White Lotus again, he carefully examined White Lotus's face, silently staring. After a long while, he suddenly sighed softly, saying to himself, "It really seems a bit similar." After saying this, he didn't say anything more. He only looked like he had made up his mind, no longer hesitating. His hand that was holding her, suddenly clenched tightly, and then he closed his eyes. The room was extremely quiet until suddenly, a low whistling sound could be heard from an unknown place. Then, a gust of wind blew from a corner of the room, blowing up a corner of Bai Lian's cloak. The man sitting next to the young girl had a calm expression, his eyes tightly closed, as if he was concentrating on thinking about something. And on his body, there was suddenly a faint light, and then darkness rose, turning into a dark flame, silently. "Everything depends on your own fate, okay." There was a hint of helplessness in his words, but it also made others feel that he was being particularly irresponsible. Perhaps if White Lotus were awake right now, she would probably be seething with anger and give Lu Chen a good scolding. The black flame burned, moving around Lu Chen's body, and then gradually gathered on his right arm, beginning to move closer to White Lotus's soft hand. Outside the room, Black Dog, who was lying on the ground lazily, suddenly felt something. It turned back to look at the closed door of the room, a faint dark flame also flashed in its eyes, but after a while, it buried its head between its front legs, lying on the ground, and yawned. Sometimes, people are so stupid, always looking for trouble for themselves, right? When the sky was completely dark, Atsu was lying on the stone steps outside the door, snoring loudly. The cold night wind blew past, ruffling the shiny black fur on Atsu's body. It didn't seem to care about the cold at all, and it didn't disturb its sweet dream at all. But suddenly, there was a sudden light footstep behind it, and the ears of Atsu, which was still asleep a moment ago, suddenly pricked up, and then its eyes opened. Two cold green lights suddenly appeared in the dark night. The footsteps immediately stopped, but it was already too late. Atsu's entire body was like a taut spring, leaping up in an instant. In the darkness of the night, he was like a deep bow and arrow, flying over in an instant. Accompanied by a terrifying roar, he instantly pounced on the figure that suddenly appeared and threw him to the ground. Then, his snow-white fangs were already on the person's neck. In the next moment, the person's neck was about to be bitten off. "Hey, hey, hey! Stop, it's me, old ma, it's me." The person who was pounced on struggled desperately, but then he resisted, because his neck was being bitten by a row of terrifying teeth, and his skin was a little painful, as if it would break and bleed at any moment. Atsu's movement paused for a moment, and after a moment, the dark green light in its eyes gradually faded. It then opened its mouth, took 2 steps back, and returned to the stone steps in front of the door, lying on the ground, and yawned. From the beginning to the end, this dog didn't seem to show any feelings of guilt or embarrassment for biting the wrong person, as if nothing had happened. Old Ma sat up from the ground, touched his thick and short neck with his hand, and couldn't help but curse, and then said to Atsu not far away, "Stupid dog, you almost bit me to death, do you know that?" Atsu glanced at him lazily, and wagged its tail, which seemed to be expressing a very reluctant apology. Old Ma was half to death by this dog, and stood up while cursing, but there was nothing he could do, because behind this dog was Lu Chen. He glanced around, and then looked at the door, and said, "Is Lu Chen inside?" Atsu did not respond. Old Ma wanted to go forward and knock on the door, but Atsu suddenly stood up, stopped him, and stared at him, not letting him go up the stairs. Old Ma was stunned for a moment and frowned. What is he doing inside? Why don't you let me disturb him? I have something urgent to tell him. Atsu wagged its tail, and didn't say a word, looking like a strong guard. Old Ma was a little helpless, and said to himself, have I become stupid? Why do I have to reason with this dog? Just when he was hesitating whether to leave, suddenly he heard the door behind Atsu squeak, but it was open from the inside, and then the figure of Lu Qin slowly came out. A looming smell of blood floated over with his steps. Old Ma was delighted, and hurriedly greeted him, saying, you finally came out, did you hear what I said? Let me tell you. Lu Qin seemed to be a little tired, and gently waved his hand to stop Old Ma. After a moment of silence, he suddenly said to Old Ma with a little determination, I have to leave. Old Ma was stunned, and for a moment he forgot what he wanted to say, and said, where are you going? To the barren valley, said Lu Qin, I have to go there. Chapter 605. Go to the barren valley? Old Ma was taken aback. He hesitated for a while before saying, why do you suddenly want to go there? Lu Qin took 2 steps forward and sat down on the stone steps at the door. Then, he said tiredly, no reason. I just want to go there and have a look. Come on. Old Ma scoffed at his excuse and retorted rudely, no one on this mountain will believe your words. What's the reason? After saying that, Old Ma seemed to feel that his tone was a little impulsive, so he calmed his tone and sighed. He said to Lu Qin, it's not like you don't know the situation in the immortal city now. Even if I wanted to slip away, I would be stopped, let alone you. Yes, he was the only personal disciple of perfected Lord Tianlan, the appointed successor of this grand foundation, the person who was the focus of attention on the entire Sky Dragon Mountain and Zhengxianmeng. No matter where Lu Qin went, there would be people watching him openly or secretly, let alone leaving the immortal city to go to such a remote place like the barren valley. Even if he really went to the barren valley, he would definitely not be the only person in the valley. There would definitely be many other people who would want to know why he suddenly went to the valley at such a tense moment. Moreover, that incident had happened in the barren valley, which would be even more thought-provoking. And in the end, there was still perfected Lord Tianlan standing there. Would he agree to Lu Qin leaving? Lu Qin only felt that his mind was in a mess. This was a situation that he had not been in for many years. It made him feel a little surprised and confused. However, in his mind, those unclear, blurry, and faintly soul-stirring scenes really made him unable to feel at ease. In that lost blank memory, there seemed to be something very important that he had forgotten. Atsu leaned against Lu Qin's feet and accompanied him silently. Old Ma looked at him for a while and finally felt that Lu Qin's reaction was really different from before. He started to worry. He walked to Lu Qin's side and patted him on the shoulder. What happened? Can you tell me? He asked in a low voice. Lu Qin sat in silence for a while before raising his head to look into Old Ma's eyes. He smiled and said, actually, I'm just annoyed and want to go out to relax. But since you came over to talk to me, I feel much better. Old Ma looked at him deeply. After a while, he nodded and said, that's good. By the way, what did you want to tell me just now? I think it's something urgent, Lu Qin said to Old Ma. Oh, that's right. Old Ma seemed to have remembered his mission and forgot all the questions from before. He said, Hall leader Shuang sent someone to tell you to go to the haunted house immediately. She's waiting for you there. Lu Qin was startled. He showed a trace of surprise and said, why did she go there again? The so-called haunted house was actually the house where Qin had the accident a few days ago. After the incident, although Fuyunji acted quickly and sealed off the scene, especially the bedroom where the murder took place, there was no such thing as an airtight wall in the world. Very soon, some news and rumors were quietly spread and transmitted secretly in Zhengxianmeng. In fact, the content of the rumors was very simple. It was nothing more than the scene of the murder that took place in the house was extremely horrifying. It didn't seem like something a normal person would do. Of course, those who would kill women and children were definitely not normal people either. However, after a period of time, a very strange rumor suddenly appeared in Zhengxianmeng. It was said that although the house looked fine before, in fact, a long time ago, another murder had taken place. It was very inauspicious. However, many years later, no one knew whether it was forgotten or did not care about this taboo, but the house was given to Chen He and his family to live in. As time went by, many people directly called the house a haunted house. However, there was a hidden meaning in this rumor, and the spearhead was faintly aimed at the people in Fuyunji. Of course, Lu Chen had also heard of this rumor, but he didn't pay much attention to it. At this moment, when he heard what old Ma said, he frowned. On the other hand, old Ma's face looked a little solemn. He actually looked around first, then lowered his voice and said to Lu Chen, in a secret place in the house, someone found something. Lu Chen looked at him and said, what thing? Old Ma didn't directly give an answer. He only said, I'm not too sure, but according to the news from hall leader Shui, it seems to have something to do with the devil cult. Lu Chen's face suddenly became gloomy. That house was originally for Chen He and his family to live in. Chen He's identity was originally sensitive, and he came here to seek refuge from the devil cult. If they found something related to the devil cult in that house, there would be too many possibilities in it. Did he really seek refuge, or did he have other intentions? There was real evidence, and someone was trying to frame him. Lu Chen only felt that his eyes seemed to be in a mess again. It was hard to see clearly. It seemed that ever since he recalled that vague memory, his mind was always a little confused. He sighed, nodded to old Ma, and said, then let's go there. Old Ma responded. Lu Chen stood up and hesitated for a moment. He looked back at the house, then reached out and closed the door. Then he told Atsu, you still stay here, don't let anyone else in, understand? Atsu barked twice, but it seemed to be a little dissatisfied. Lu Chen touched its head and comforted it, saying, do me a favor, old Ma, and I will go there for a while, and we will be back soon. Probably the words, we'll be back soon, made Atsu feel at ease. It quieted down and then lay on the ground. Lu Chen smiled, waved to old Ma, and walked forward. The road outside was still shrouded in darkness, but when he looked into the distance, Lu Chen suddenly found that on the distant horizon, there seemed to be a faint glimmer of light. He kept walking and gazed into the distance. For a moment, he suddenly thought of something. It had been so many years. It had been so long since the Battle of the Barren Valley. Countless days and nights, countless things, pain, good times, and bad times, but there had never been a memory of that blank period in his mind. But why, this time, he suddenly remembered it. Although it was still vague, he vaguely felt that it was not an illusion. Something must have happened, but he could not remember it. That feeling, it was as if some kind of power had silently sealed that memory in his mind, but he did not know why. Suddenly, the seal was suddenly broken. So what was the reason for this action? What kind of power had suddenly broken the strange seal in his memory? Chapter 606. The haunted house on Mount Tianlong that was gradually becoming famous was located on the side of Fuyunji territory, so it didn't take Lu Chen and old Ma much time to get there. However, even though Lu Chen was a man with a strong will, he didn't have the perverted hobby of liking bloody scenes. So after the incident here came to an end, he didn't come to the vicinity anymore. Even recalling the scene in that bedroom wasn't a pleasant thing. When they walked outside the haunted house, Lu Chen saw the Fuyunji people guarding around the house. Of course, the number of people was much less than on the night of the murder, but it was enough to stop people with ulterior motives from entering. At this time, the sky was still dark, and the faint light in the distance was slightly brighter. However, the darkness before dawn still seemed to be suppressing the light, making one's heart feel stifled. Seeing Lu Chen and old Ma walk over, the guards standing at the gate quickly came to welcome them. It seemed like they had already received orders, so they directly let Lu Chen and old Ma in. They also explained that Hall Master Shui and the others were waiting at the crime scene for young Master Lu's arrival. Lu Chen nodded and walked in with old Ma. After entering the door of the haunted house, they could clearly feel a sense of coldness. Although the houses and pavilions looked the same as a few days ago, it gave off a lifeless and gloomy feeling. Old Ma couldn't help but frown. He said to Lu Chen in a low voice, "Is there really something strange about this house? It makes people feel a little uncomfortable the moment they enter." Lu Chen glanced at him and said, "Could it be that you're thinking too much?" Old Ma grunted and said, "That's not for sure. After such a terrible thing happened, of course, no one would stay here anymore. Even Chen He had to find another place for him to settle down. This was to prevent him from feeling sad and causing more trouble." As for the haunted house, it had naturally been thoroughly searched by the people of Fuyunji. Even today, they had called Lu Chen over because Blood Warbler and the others seemed to have made a new discovery. However, just like how time would always pass, memories would always be hard to grasp. No matter how ghastly the bloodstains were, no matter how tragic, it would eventually dry up. The thick and horrifying smell of blood in the air had mostly dissipated, leaving only a little bit of the smell, which still reminded people of that horrible scene. Lu Chen inexplicably felt a burst of irritation in his heart, but he still endured it on his face and did not reveal any emotions. Soon, the two of them walked into the backyard and saw Shuang standing in the middle of the courtyard with her hands behind her back, quietly looking up at the sky. In this dark night before dawn, this beautiful woman looked a bit thinner. Although it didn't reduce her charm and elegance, it made people feel that she was vaguely heart-wrenching at this moment. Perhaps she was going to spend the whole night here. Lu Chen and Old Ma walked over. Hearing the sound of footsteps, Shuang turned around. Her gaze swept across Lu Chen and Old Ma's faces, then she nodded slightly as a greeting. There was a hint of alienation in her politeness. Lu Chen asked, "Hall Master Shui, I heard that something was discovered here." Shuang grunted and said, "Yes, and they suspect that the thing they discovered is related to the Devil Sect. Because you are very familiar with the Devil Sect, they wanted you to come and take a look. I'm sorry to disturb you so late at night." Lu Chen couldn't tell whether Shui Ying's apology was real or fake, but since she said so, he could only respond, "It's fine, the matter here is more important." "Then shall we go and take a look?" Shuang nodded and gestured with her hand, then led the way to the bedroom. Lu Chen looked in that direction and frowned slightly, but he didn't hesitate to follow. Old Ma, on the other hand, stood where he was, a little hesitant. But in the end, he sighed and followed the two of them into the bedroom. There were candles and lamplight in the bedroom. It wasn't as dark as it was on the night of the murder, illuminating most of the room. Lu Chen stood at the door and looked around. He could vaguely make out the original layout of this place. It was an ordinary but warm residential room. But now, of course, everything was different. Most of the furniture had fallen to the ground, and even if it wasn't broken, it was stained with blood. Even the floor was covered with dark red stains, big and dirty. The corpses that had once laid here were long gone. Lu Chen suddenly thought of a phrase, "to bury in peace." Unfortunately, his own rationality told him that those poor women and children might not be able to find peace even now. This matter was too big, and the repercussions were too bad. The Floating Clouds office had to investigate this thoroughly. Only then would they be able to give everyone an explanation. More accurately, it was for Shuang to give an explanation to Supreme Tianlan. The corpses of those who had died might still be preserved by Fuyunji, stored in some secret place. As for the wishes of those who had died, or even the wishes of the living like Chen He, everyone could comfort and sympathize, but no one would care. Shuang walked into the depths of the room and stepped over the shocking bloodstains on the ground. She stood beside the large bed that had already tilted to one side, then waved at Lu Chen. Lu Chen walked over, and Shuang pointed at the bed and said in a low voice, "We only found it last night, it's behind there." Lu Chen was startled at first, but then he immediately understood. The subordinates of Fuyunji were used to seeing life and death murders all year round, and they had always been meticulous in their work. After this murder, this haunted house must have been thoroughly searched inside and out. No matter how hidden the corners, or how well hidden the secret rooms, they would all be found by these people, and no one would be spared. So before coming here, Lu Chen was a little puzzled as to why there was a fish that had slipped through the net. The secret was only discovered today, and he was called over. But now that he had a look here, he understood. The floor under the bedboard must have been carefully examined by someone. However, it was probably due to the human mind that the back of the bedboard had been overlooked. It seemed like a very simple trick, but it was able to fool those experienced hands. To be able to set up this kind of setup, one must not be underestimated. Old Ma walked over with a lamp. In the light, Lu Chen grabbed the bed and exerted force, flipping the entire bed over. As he flipped it, his hands actually felt a little strained. The weight of the bed was actually quite heavy, indicating that the wood was very thick and good. In the blink of an eye, the board flipped over, and the lamp fell on the back of the board, illuminating everything and showing a circular pattern in front of them. In the middle of the circle, there was a tall, straight tree connecting the top and bottom. The branches in the middle were forked, and each branch had a layer. Each layer had a different pattern carved on it. There were birds and beasts, Shura demons, humans, immortals, and monsters. The rest of the empty spaces were also carved with many things, looking very strange. The room was very quiet. Shuang watched as Lu Chen squatted down and carefully examined the pattern. After waiting for a while, she asked Lu Chen in a low voice, "This pattern, is it related to the devil cult?" Lu Chen slowly stood up, then turned to look at Shuang. After a moment of silence, his gaze deepened, and he slowly said, "Detain Chen He first." Chapter 607. Why? Shuang stood there without moving. Her expression was a little ugly, but she did not show any signs of anger. In fact, even her tone was a little low. She only said calmly, "No matter what, before I act, you have to give me an explanation. This is the Devil Sect's Tree of God diagram. I believe you are not unfamiliar with it." Lu Chen pointed at the diagram on the back of the bed and said, "In the past battles with the Devil Sect, you should have seen some similar diagrams. This is because in the Devil Sect's mythological system, this Tree of God diagram is actually divided into high and low levels. Ordinary disciples draw the lowest level Tree of God diagram, and only the higher-ups of the Devil Sect understand the meaning of the higher level Tree of God diagram." Lu Chen's finger slowly swept across the branches of the Tree of God. His voice was calm but powerful as he said, "The Devil Sect's imprint that we usually see is the lowest level Tree of God diagram. There is only a towering Tree of God inside. This Tree of God diagram has the meaning of merging the three realms and all living beings. It is an extremely high-level secret in the Devil Sect." He paused, then said, almost exactly what someone like Chen He, who is second only to one but above tens of thousands of people, would understand. But why would he draw this in his own home? This is the Zhengxian Meng headquarters. Is that guy's brain broken? This time, the one who could not help but ask was not the silent Shuang, but old Ma who was standing at the side. Looking at his stunned face, it was obvious that he could not understand this. Hearing this, Shuang also looked at Lu Chen, obviously also a little puzzled. Lu Chen stood up from the ground, his brows slightly furrowed, as if he was a little hesitant, but in the end he nodded and said, "It's like this, some people in the Devil Sect, many people, they are actually very firm in their belief in the Devil Sect's evil path of legend. Chen He is probably such a person." Shui Ying's face looked a little cold as she said, "Then why did he betray the Devil Sect and rely on us?" Lu Chen shook his head and said, "No, he did not betray the Devil Sect's belief. From the beginning, it was the Devil Sect's demons who fell into our trap. Elder Ghost ordered to kill his family, so Chen He had no choice but to rebel. What he betrayed was Elder Ghost, not the evil faction's faith, so most probably after he came to our place, he was still anxious and uneasy in his heart, so he quietly carved this picture of the divine tree. Only when he is accompanied by it day and night, he can fall asleep." Even Shuang and old Ma, these two people who were usually not very close or familiar with each other, involuntarily revealed a startled expression as they exchanged glances. A moment later, Shuang suddenly laughed coldly and said, "Looks like you really know everything about the devil cult. Of Devil Sect, you did not waste after staying with them for so many years. Lu Chen lowered his gaze slightly. No one knew what he was feeling at the moment, but he didn't explain anything. He just calmly said, I've said it before. This painting was most likely created by Chen He himself. It's best to capture him first. Does Hall Master Shui have any objections? As soon as he said this, Shui Ying's expression turned ugly. Just as she was about to say something else, the light in the room suddenly dimmed, and the candles in the room swayed violently. The three people in the room were shocked. They turned around and saw a huge figure standing at the door. He was facing the bedroom and looking at them indifferently. It was true Lord Tianlan. Old Ma was the first to bow, followed by Shuang and Lu Chen. True Lord Tianlan slowly walked into the room. His face was calm and indifferent, as if he was not affected by the bloody and mournful aura. He walked to Lu Chen's side and looked at the Tree of God diagram on the wooden board for a while. Then, he looked at Shuang and asked, did Lu Chen's words make sense? Shuang wanted to say something but hesitated. After a while, she took a light breath and said in a low voice, it makes sense. Chen He is indeed very suspicious. But this subordinate thinks that drawing this Tree of God diagram and killing a family of women and children are two different things. He shouldn't. True Lord Tianlan raised his hand to stop Shuang from speaking. He glanced at Lu Chen and said, do you think Chen He is the real culprit? No. Lu Chen did not hesitate and immediately answered, on the night of the incident, Old Ma and I saw him at the Tingyu Tower. At least according to the time, he was not here. After a pause, Lu Chen said, I didn't say he killed his family. I just feel that this person is still thinking about the devil's sect. We can't be careless. It's best to detain him first. True Lord Tianlan nodded indifferently and said to Shuang, did you hear that? Shuang looked down and said, yes. True Lord Tianlan said, take Chen He first and interrogate him in detail. Shuang responded and turned to leave. After she left, True Lord Tianlan did not say anything more and also turned to walk out of the house. But on the way, he said to Lu Chen, you come too. Follow me to the underground city. Lu Chen was startled and immediately understood. It seemed that the strange phenomenon in the underground city that he mentioned to True Lord Tianlan was a very important matter to this person. He needed to go check and deal with it immediately. This bald True Lord seemed to attach great importance to the empty and mysterious underground city. Lu Chen agreed and followed him out of the door. Old Ma was a little hesitant and did not know whether he should follow them or not. But then he saw Lu Chen wave his hand slightly when he passed by him, indicating that he did not want him to follow. Old Ma was relieved. At the same time, he was a little curious about what happened in the underground city. After the two people left, Old Ma was left alone in the bedroom. Old Ma could not help but walk to the side of the bed and squat down to take a closer look at the picture of the divine tree. This time, after looking at it for a long time, he gradually frowned and revealed a puzzled expression. It seemed that he saw something that he did not quite understand and was a little puzzled. On the way to the entrance of the underground cave at the foot of the mountain, True Lord Tianlan and Lu Chen walked all the way. To be exact, Lu Chen was always one step behind True Lord Tianlan, walking on his side and behind him. True Lord Tianlan did not say anything about it. After walking for a while and seeing no one around, he suddenly asked Lu Chen, how is White Lotus? After a moment of silence, Lu Chen said, I helped her to recuperate, but she has not woken up yet. I don't know whether she's alive or not. It all depends on her luck. True Lord Tianlan replied with an, oh, and took 2 steps forward, saying, you seem to be soft-hearted recently. Lu Chen raised his head and glanced at his tall silhouette, not saying a word. True Lord Tianlan also did not say anything about it. The master and disciple seemed to have nothing to say and went down the mountain just like that. However, when they reached the long street, True Lord Tianlan suddenly asked, you said that the picture of the divine tree was only of an extremely high level. Isn't that the highest level of the divine tree in the devil cult? Lu Chen said, yes. True Lord Tianlan asked, what does the highest level of the divine tree look like? Lu Chen hesitated for a moment and then said, it's a scene of the collapse of the sky and the collapse of the three realms. The divine tree runs through the sky and the devil god descends. All living beings prostrate and unite. Perfected Lord Tianlan's footsteps came to a sudden halt. Chapter 608. Lu Chen saw that perfected Lord Tianlan stopped but did not turn around. He just looked into the distance. He looked in the direction of perfected Lord Tianlan's gaze and saw that the sun had finally broken through the horizon in the distance. Its warm radiance dyed the sky red, bringing light and hope to the world. It's daybreak, perfected Lord Tianlan suddenly said. Lu Chen nodded and said, yes, it's daybreak. Perfected Lord Tianlan stared at the rising sun and said, do you believe in the words of the devil cult? No. Lu Chen said, if I believed in those nonsense, I wouldn't have done those things in the barren valley. Perfected Lord Tianlan nodded slowly and said, you're right. At that time, the demons of the devil cult were only one step away from the true God's descent. So on the matter of the devil cult, even if I don't believe in anyone in the world, I will definitely believe in you. Lu Chen looked at him and perfected Lord Tianlan turned back, smiled at him and even patted Lu Chen's shoulder. There were some words that they should understand in their hearts, but they wouldn't say it out loud. For people at this level, in a sense, trust was often more important than ability. No matter what one's background, character, ability, or means, trust was the most difficult thing to obtain. Standing at the peak of the human race, deity stage perfected cultivators had seen through the superficial and fickle human affairs and the changes of the world. In the bloody battles with the devil cult over the years, mutual deceit and intrigue had become commonplace. They, who had to be on guard against the weapons stabbing from behind at all times, were the ones who valued and trusted the most. Perhaps it was because of this that perfected Lord Tianlan had always regarded Lu Chen with special respect. Only he had always believed that no matter how the world changed, only Lu Chen would always stand with him and would never conspire with the devil cult. By the way, Supreme Lord Tianlan turned around and continued to walk forward. At the same time, he said casually, you've been in the devil cult for so many years. I heard that those evildoers are very good at brainwashing. Why are you still able to stay awake? Lu Chen followed behind him. After a moment of silence, he said, you taught me. Perfected Lord Tianlan glanced at him before bursting into laughter. There seemed to be a hint of gratification and joy in his laughter. With the three of us here, moving unhindered throughout the world is a small matter. In this world, there is not a single person who can contend against us. Even that bastard Tianlan has no choice but to lower his head. A slightly complacent voice came from the main hall of the Starry Hall. Of course, such rash and bold words could not be heard by too many people. Therefore, at this moment, there were only 3 people sitting in the Starry Hall. They were the 3 famous perfected lords of the divine transformation realm in Zhengxianmeng. They were the master of the Starry Hall, perfected Gu Yu, the master of the heavenly law hall, perfected Tai Hu, and perfected Guangbo. The one who was speaking now was perfected Guangbo. He looked excited and expectant. Obviously, he was very proud of himself for organizing this secret alliance against perfected Lord Tianlan and the Fiunji faction. He almost patted his chest and boasted. Compared to perfected Guangbo's arrogance and complacency, perfected Gu Yu and perfected Tai Hu looked calmer. Among them, perfected Gu Yu pondered for a moment and looked at perfected Tai Hu. Then, he asked, you really can't persuade perfected Golden Dragon and perfected Flowing Cloud? Immortal Guangbo's expression froze. Immortal Tiehu, who was sitting beside him, continued, yes, I've talked to the 2 of them in private. Immortal Golden Dragon said that he's old and probably doesn't have much time left, so he doesn't want to be involved in these matters. Immortal Lu Yun, on the other hand, is trying to comprehend the mystical arts and has been in seclusion for 20 years. He's reached a critical juncture and can't be distracted. Perfected Gu Yu nodded slowly. Seeing his expression, perfected Guangbo hurriedly said, Even so, these two perfected immortals have promised in private that they will restrain their subordinates and never get involved in unnecessary things. In fact, with the strength of the three of us, we have an overwhelming advantage over Fuyunji. As long as they don't play any tricks and don't side with Tianlan, we will definitely win. Perfected Guyu still looked a little worried. He said in a low voice, could it be that these two are hesitant and secretly tell this to Tianlan? Perfected Guangbo frowned and glanced at Perfected Taihu. Perfected Taihu smiled and said confidently, I can be sure of this. They won't do that. Based on their temperament, they can easily find an excuse to make it hard to distinguish the truth from the lies. But if there is a conflict, they will most likely sit on the mountain and watch the tigers fight. After that, we will give them some small benefits and they will naturally leave. Perfected Guyu clapped his hands and said with a smile, Brother Tai who is indeed astute. Everything is under control. Since this is the case, let's do it. Tai who smiled and Perfected Guangbo was very happy. He clapped his hands and said, that's right. When the time comes, we will get rid of those ambitious people and clear up the universe. When the righteous return to peace, it will be a blessing for all people. A blessing for all people. Perfected Guyu silently repeated these words in his heart. He was a little speechless, but he did not show it on his face. He still smiled and applauded Perfected Guangbo's bold words. Then, as if he suddenly thought of something, he frowned and said, speaking of which, since we are going to do such a big thing, we should have a name. Since we are an alliance, we should also have a person to take charge of the overall situation, give orders and judge the situation. Only then can we unify the command and achieve great things. As soon as he said this, Perfected Taihu and Perfected Guangbo nodded in agreement, but neither of them said anything after that. Guyu True Monarch frowned, and after a while, said to the two, I think, this alliance can be called, Heaven Breaker. As for the responsibility of being the leader, I am willing to be your assistant, and run errands everywhere, I will not shirk. Very good, very good. Brother Guyu deserves it, you deserve it. The two people opposite him nodded and looked at each other with a smile. But other than that, no one was willing to say a word more. But the meaning in the silence seemed to be obvious. Choose me. Choose me. These two words seemed to have been engraved in their eyes and written on their faces. Everyone knew that once they were in charge, they would have great power in their hands. The most important thing was that when it was time to divide the profits after the matter was completed, they would definitely get the biggest share. Wasn't this the reason why everyone fought with their lives and even fell out with that madman Tianlan for the sake of justice in the world? Justice and justice. What was that? Could it be eaten? Could it feed so many people under them? The two looked at Perfected Guyu with smiles on their faces. Obviously, they were waiting for Perfected Guyu to continue speaking and say that name. Even though Perfected Guyu's cultivation was profound, his willpower was firm, and he was mentally prepared, but at this moment, being looked at like this by the two people, he felt his heart numb. After all, they were both spirit-severing perfected cultivators. The consequences of getting angry. Even people of the same level would be afraid of it. He took a deep breath and thought for a while. Then, he showed a trace of embarrassment on his face. After a while, he took a deep breath and said, in my opinion, the position of the main leader must belong to Brother Taihu. Crack. A crisp sound was heard. It was the teacup in Perfected Guangbo's hand that exploded and turned into powder. Chapter 609. The main hall of the Starry Hall was large and spacious. Now that there were only 3 of them, of course, it would not be very lively. Therefore, the sound of the teacup being crushed sounded particularly loud and clear. Even the guards outside the main hall, who were separated by a closed door, were startled and turned to look in this direction. In the main hall, Immortal Guangbo looked a little gloomy. The spilled tea stained his hands and slowly dripped down, but he did not care. As for the other 2 people sitting at the side, Immortal Tiehu seemed to have suddenly become deaf and did not hear anything. He calmly picked up his teacup and took a sip of tea. As for Immortal Guyu, he had a bitter smile on his face and sighed. Although he had already made up his mind, and although he had expected this situation in advance, when faced with the anger of a Huashan perfected cultivator, even if he was not weaker than the other party, the pressure was still very heavy. In this world, no one knew better than the Huashan perfected cultivator how terrifying a great cultivator who had cultivated to this level was. However, when Immortal Guyu thought of this helplessly, he suddenly felt a jolt in his heart and became absent-minded for a moment. It had been many years since a great cultivator who had cultivated to the Huashan realm was killed. Huashan perfected cultivators were known to be extremely difficult to kill. Even old and weak Huashan perfected cultivators could not be underestimated. Therefore, for many years, almost no one had thought of killing a Huashan perfected cultivator, let alone taking action. In that case, when on earth did Tianlan have such a thought in his mind? Immortal Guyu suddenly thought of Hakushin Jinkun of the Kunlun party who suddenly passed away a few years ago. For a 1,000-year-old sect like the Kunlun party, some things were destined to be hidden forever, and outsiders would never know the truth. However, perfected Lord Guyu quickly recalled the scene at that time. He remembered very clearly that at that time, perfected Lord Tianlan had left Zhengxianmeng ahead of time and returned to Kunlun Mountain. After that, there were several news channels that there was an intense change in the depths of Kunlun Mountain. Even one of the most famous 4 great peaks in the sky and clouds had been destroyed. That was the winter peak where Hakushin Jinkuan's cave was located. All these thoughts flashed through Guyu's mind in an instant. He thought about everything that had happened and felt a slight chill in his heart. However, after a short while, he temporarily suppressed those distracting thoughts, and a smile appeared on his face again as he faced the seemingly thorny problem in front of him. Immortal Guangbo looked very angry, annoyed, and furious. He seemed to be about to explode. If that happened, then all their previous plans would be in vain. Immortal Guyu smiled, stood up, and walked to Immortal Guangbo. He casually handed over a soft silk handkerchief for him to wipe his hands and said with a smile, "Brother Guangbo, you have always been calm and composed. This is not like you usually." Immortal Guangbo snorted, but he did not immediately turn hostile. He took the silk handkerchief and began to wipe his hands. The tense atmosphere suddenly relaxed a lot. Immortal Guyu smiled and took another step forward. At this moment, he had his back to Immortal Tiehu and was facing Guangbo. He reached out to clean up the debris on the table. Immortal Guangbo frowned slightly. Although he was very unhappy now, there was no reason for him to let another perfected cultivator of Huashan realm clean up these things in front of him. In any case, Immortal Guyu was not a servant, but a real perfected cultivator of Huashan realm. If he ignored it, it would be a bit insulting and contemptuous. Thus, Immortal Guangbo could only pout and stop Immortal Guyu. He said in a muffled voice, "Why are you collecting these things? Let someone else do it later." However, halfway through his sentence, perfected Lord Guangbo suddenly saw perfected Lord Guyu raise her eyebrows and secretly gave him a meaningful look. Immortal Guangbo's heart skipped a beat, but he still stopped Immortal Guyu. Of course, Immortal Guyu could not really do these things, so he stopped and looked up at Immortal Tiehu. He said, "Brother Tiehu, Brother Guangbo, in my opinion, this matter should be settled. After all, even if we succeed in the future, the 3 of us will have the final say on how to split the profits. How about we wait until then?" Immortal Tiehu was the first to nod and said with a smile, "That's a good idea. It's settled then." He then looked at Immortal Guangbo. Immortal Guangbo looked unlucky and had a complicated expression on his face. He seemed to be calculating in his heart and finally came to a conclusion. He let out a long sigh and said, "That's settled then." Immortal Tiehu laughed and looked very proud. Immortal Tianlan and Lu Chen walked to the long street under the light of the morning sun. They looked at the Fuyunji guards who were guarding outside the curtains. Among them, Lu Chen saw the leader, Lu Ting, whom he had noticed the other day. However, at this time, Lu Ting did not seem to have noticed the 2 big shots who were walking over from the distance. He looked dispirited and seemed to be a different person from when he met Lu Chen. Lu Chen felt a little strange, but then he saw that the morale of the guards around Lu Ting was not high. His heart moved and he could roughly guess the reason. These guards seemed to have been on duty for the whole night, but Lu Chen clearly remembered their expressions when he brought White Lotus out. It was impossible to hide this matter in broad daylight. Now that so much time had passed, it was needless to say that the upper echelons of Fuyunji, especially Xueying, must have known about it. He let White Lotus sneak into the underground, and so many people actually did not notice. This was definitely going to cause trouble, but it had not been dealt with yet. However, with Xueying's methods, she would definitely make Lu Ting and the others suffer. It was no wonder that Lu Ting and the others were frowning. While he was thinking, Immortal Tianlan had already walked close to the entrance of the underground tunnel. The guards at the outermost area were just about to give him a warning and drive him away when their bodies suddenly shook and their eyes widened in disbelief. After a while, they were so frightened that they jumped up and saluted. Lu Ting, who was at the back, had not reacted yet. He was so preoccupied that he did not even look over. He was so anxious that a guard went over and pushed him hard. Lu Ting staggered and almost fell to the ground. He was furious and was about to curse when Tianlan and Lu Chen's figures suddenly appeared in his sight. Lu Ting shuddered and immediately strode forward. However, he stammered as he looked at perfected Lord Tianlan, a big shot who was usually revered like a god, standing there. His body trembled slightly, but he did not know what to say. At this moment, Lu Chen, who was standing beside Immortal Tianlan, smiled and said to Immortal Tianlan, "Master, this person is called Lu Ting, a guard captain in Fuyunji. He usually does his work well, but he suffered because of oxen a few days ago." If Lu Chen had only mentioned how Lu Ting was capable, perfected Lord Tianlan would probably have nodded his head at most and would not have paid any attention to it. However, perfected Lord Tianlan was a little surprised when he suddenly mentioned the green bull. He took another look at Lu Ting and asked, "What's going on?" Lu Chen smiled and said, "That day, oxen suddenly insisted on going down here and it was difficult for them to guard. You also know oxen's temper, so they suffered a lot. Fortunately, I passed by here later and showed up to take oxen down, otherwise it would have been a lot of trouble." Perfected Lord Tianlan acknowledged and nodded. "Well done." After a pause, he suddenly glanced at Lu Chen and said lightly, "Do a good job in the future. Fuyunji is the fairest place. Those who are capable will definitely be promoted." Lu Ting was overjoyed. His legs turned to jelly and he knelt down. The guards behind him also knelt down and thanked him profusely. Immortal Tianlan did not say much and walked over directly. When Lu Chen followed him, he took a look at Lu Ting and saw that Lu Ting's eyes were filled with gratitude and he nodded heavily at him. Chapter 610. He was not an emperor, but he was better than one. The surrounding people were prostrating before that tall figure with looks of admiration and gratitude on their faces. All of this was because of a simple sentence from perfected Lord Tianlan. He did not even give a solid promise. Just a simple compliment was enough to make these people so agitated. Lu Chen stood beside perfected Lord Tianlan and watched all of this in silence. Then, the two of them walked into the underground tunnel. Lu Ting and the other guards followed in fear and trepidation. They did not even dare to speak to perfected Lord Tianlan and could only ask Lu Chen carefully if he needed their help. Moreover, their faces were filled with anticipation and desire, as if it would be their greatest honor if perfected Lord Tianlan needed their help. It seemed like they were even willing to go through fire and water for him without any hesitation. Lu Chen politely but firmly rejected them. The surrounding guards looked as if it was only natural and agreed repeatedly, respectfully sending the two lords into the underground world. After entering the underground tunnel, the voices behind them disappeared and the surroundings became quiet. Only the footsteps of perfected Lord Tianlan and Lu Chen could be heard. It really felt as if they had suddenly entered another world from the noisy mortal world. After walking for a while, perfected Lord Tianlan suddenly said, "When those people outside were kneeling to us, I noticed that your expression was a little unnatural." "What's wrong?" Lu Chen was silent for a moment before saying, "This is the first time so many people have knelt before me. Although they are mainly kneeling to you, I still feel a little strange." Perfected Lord Tianlan said, "Did they do this when you were in the fiend cult?" Lu Chen thought for a moment before saying, "Basically not. Occasionally, there will be some master and disciple kneeling to each other. However, the fiend cult does not pay attention to such things, so it's very rare." Perfected Lord Tianlan was silent for a moment before saying, "You should know that I didn't ask them to kneel to me. Those people outside all wanted to kneel on their own, or when someone took the lead, everyone followed suit." Lu Chen nodded. "I understand." After saying that, he paused for a moment before smiling as if he was mocking himself. "Actually, I've also knelt to you before. Speaking of which, I'm not qualified to laugh at them. Those people are all small fries. Humans are born with the mentality of looking up to the strong." Perfected Lord Tianlan said calmly, "Too many people have always admired and looked up to the high and mighty experts, thinking that they are omnipotent. It's as if there's a dazzling brilliance around those experts no matter how you look at them. They've reduced themselves to dust and become ants." He looked at Lu Chen and said, "Do you think I'm right?" He looked at Lu Chen and said, "Do you think what I said makes sense?" Perfected Lord Tianlan replied, "Of course, there will always be some ambitious elites. However, what do you think if I say that most mortals are like that?" Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled and patted Lu Chen's shoulder with a gentle expression and gaze. "You're different from them. Don't be like this." Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled and patted Lu Chen's shoulder with a gentle expression and gaze. "You're different from them. Don't be like this." The red light of the blood moon had become somewhat familiar to Lu Chen. Therefore, when the light landed on him again, he even felt an inexplicable sense of intimacy. Of course, he was soon reminded of the many things that had happened in the underworld, those unpleasant memories, and his good mood was gone at once. Perfected Lord Tianlan looked up at the blood moon in the sky and narrowed his eyes as if he was observing something. After a while, he said to Lu Chen, "Bring me to the place where the accident happened." Lu Chen nodded and led him forward. Although he still hadn't figured out the secret of the underground cave and the strange blood moon in the sky, as well as what exactly Perfected Lord Tianlan wanted to do underground with the Starry Hall, it was obvious that this bald Perfected Lord was very concerned about this place and attached great importance to it. It was not easy to find a place or thing that could make Perfected Lord Tianlan come to check immediately after hearing it. The blood-red light sprinkled on them and their footsteps echoed in the empty street. The walls and doors of the big houses seemed to be stained with blood, giving off an inexplicable sense of mournfulness. Walking in this kind of place really had the illusion of walking in hell, making people feel very uncomfortable. However, Perfected Lord Tianlan and Lu Chen didn't show any discomfort on their faces. Perhaps this discomfort was nothing to them. Lu Chen had been paying attention to the surroundings while walking. The strange red mist that had floated in the air earlier was gone now, and so was the smell of blood in the air. There seemed to be no trace of what happened that day, as if it were a dream. Now, he could only go to the courtyard where the incident took place to see if there were any traces left behind. Of course, Lu Chen wouldn't suspect that his eyes were playing tricks on him or that his memory was playing tricks on him. He remembered the scene that day very clearly, including the bloody man who fell to the ground. After walking through the long street, they came to a house near the strange statue in the center of the city. Lu Chen pointed at the door and said to Perfected Lord Tianlan, "I found White Lotus in the backyard inside." Perfected Lord Tianlan nodded but didn't enter the house immediately. Instead, he looked at the terrain here first and then suddenly looked back at the huge statue that ran through the whole underground cave not far away. Then, he seemed to frown inadvertently. After a while, he said to Lu Chen, "Let's go in and have a look." Lu Chen agreed and followed him in. A gust of wind blew in from somewhere in the underground city and swept over their heads. Almost at the same time, they smelled the faint smell of blood in the wind. Perfected Lord Tianlan didn't notice it at all. With his hands behind his back and his wide robe sleeves fluttering slightly, he walked along the corridor into the backyard. Lu Chen followed him. When they walked into the backyard, a glaring and cruel red color was imprinted in their eyes. It was indeed the place that looked like a shuraba that day. Although the once scarlet blood no longer flowed and most of it had dried up and solidified, the ground, walls, and corners of the yard could still be seen with dark red bloodstains everywhere, revealing a tragic and mournful aura. Lu Chen frowned slightly and glanced at Perfected Lord Tianlan. The Perfected Lord of the Divine Transformation Realm looked calm, as if everything in front of him was no different from ordinary flowers, birds, fishes, insects, or scenery. His eyes swept over everything here calmly. Not long after, they suddenly stopped at a spot in the middle of the yard. Lu Chen followed his gaze and found that there were only a few bloodstains connected together. They looked a little scary, but other than that, there was nothing unusual. But very quickly, Lu Chen seemed to have thought of something, and his expression changed slightly. At this time, Perfected Lord Tianlan had already walked over. When he was about 4 or 5 feet away from that spot, he suddenly waved his sleeves and a gust of wind swept past. The bloodstains on the ground suddenly shattered and scattered in all directions. Then, a strange mark was revealed under the bloodstains. It looked like a human figure that had fallen to the ground. Chapter 6:11. There was only the trace of a human figure in a pool of blood on the ground, but the person who left the trace was not there and had disappeared. Lu Chen looked at the strange thing on the ground with a puzzled expression. He was extremely astonished. He had no idea what kind of technique Perfected Lord by Tianlan had used just now. It was actually able to almost completely restore the general outline of the human figure that had fallen to the ground in a pool of blood. Even though it seemed that the ground had been drowned in blood, Lu Chen was not too surprised to accurately find the place where the human figure was, but it was really incredible to be able to restore the trace in a pool of blood. At this moment, the way Lu Chen looked at Perfected Lord Tianlan was a little different. Although he had a very high evaluation of this damn Baldy in his heart, he now found that he might have underestimated this person. Were all the perfected lords of the divine transformation realm in the world so terrifying, or was it only this damn Baldy who was a rare genius? Perfected Lord Tianlan's eyes stayed on the trace of the human figure in the pool of blood for a moment, and then turned to look at Lu Chen. Lu Chen understood what he meant. After thinking for a while and looking at the surrounding terrain, he nodded and said with certainty, "It's here. That bloody man fell in this place." Perfected Lord Tianlan nodded and turned to look at the backyard full of blood. As his eyes slowly swept across, he suddenly asked Lu Chen, "You said that when you first came here to find White Lotus, you met that bloody man who was covered in blood, but his spiritual power was very strong?" "Yes," Lu Chen said, "at least at the level of Yuanying realm perfected being." Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at him and said, "Then you knocked him down?" Lu Chen's heart suddenly skipped a beat, but he did not hesitate and said, "That person seemed to have lost his mind and was like a walking corpse. He had strength but could not be used, so he was not a strong enemy." Perfected Lord Tianlan said calmly, "You didn't fight him for 300 rounds. Judging from your tone, you probably defeated that strange person in a short time. Even if it was perfected Yuanying who had lost his mind, it would be difficult for him to do that." He nodded and said, "You're even stronger than I imagined. However, I'm a little curious. Just what kind of Dao technique and divine ability did you use to be able to do this?" Lu Chen's heartbeat slowly sped up. He felt as if there were prickles on his back. A shivering feeling flashed through his mind. The tall figure looked like a tall mountain, looking down at him from above. There seemed to be a fork in the road in front of him. He didn't know what the future held, but he subconsciously felt a faint aura of death in front of him. The choice could only be made in an instant. How should he answer? Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at Lu Chen with a calm expression. No one could tell what he was thinking at the moment. Perhaps, he was just asking out of curiosity. He did not have to wait for too long because Lu Chen quickly met his gaze. There seemed to be some hesitation in his expression, but in the end, he still said, "It's a secret technique of the Devil Sect." "It's a secret technique of the Devil Sect. I learned it from Yun Shouyang," Lu Chen said. "It's evil and vicious, but very useful." The atmosphere in the courtyard seemed to have cooled down for a moment. No one spoke, and the surroundings were silent. Coupled with the bloodstains all over the ground, it was mournful and tragic. It looked really lifeless, like a ghost town. Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at his disciple quietly with a deep gaze. There seemed to be some complicated emotions in his eyes. Lu Chen, on the other hand, stood in front of him, calm and unperturbed, without the slightest hint of fear. After a long while, Perfected Lord Tianlan sighed softly and broke the atmosphere that was about to freeze. Have you thought about the consequences of using such a method? There was no one else here at that time. The only person, White Lotus, was also restricted, Lu Chen said. I won't use it when there are outsiders around. Perfected Lord Tianlan still seemed to be a little worried. He frowned and said, You have many other choices. It would be better if you could completely not use these unorthodox methods. I don't have any stronger methods. Lu Chen looked into his eyes and said, I thought you should remember that I was still a child when I was sent to the devil sect. You only taught me patience and unwavering faith. I learned most of the techniques in the devil sect. Perfected Lord Tianlan suddenly stopped talking. He pursed his lips slightly and his gaze became increasingly distant as he stared at Lu Chen. It was as if in that instant, the radiance in his eyes had already penetrated the person's bones and flesh and seen through his heart. Lu Chen, on the other hand, was still standing there. After a while, he flipped his hand, and a black dagger appeared in his hand. It was short, sharp, and carried a cold and icy killing intent. Perfected Lord Tianlan's gaze fell on the black dagger. Lu Chen said, I used it to stab Yun Shouyang's back and then destroyed the god-subduing incantation formation. After saying that, he flicked his wrist and the black dagger suddenly flew up. It wasn't fast, but it flew straight towards Supreme Lord Tianlan. However, when it was still around 2 feet away from Perfected Lord Tianlan, the black dagger abruptly paused in mid-air and remained motionless. From the beginning to the end, Perfected Lord Tianlan did not look at the black dagger at all. His gaze was always on Lu Chen's face. He was like an unreachable peak with a natural coldness. He did not care about the ants in the world and only cared about the boundless blue sky above his head. Perhaps the only dream and goal of a peak was to chase or even break through that sky. However, the person in front of him was not an ant in his heart. He was his disciple. Perfected Lord Tianlan stared at Lu Chen. Although he did not say anything, the invisible pressure was already as heavy as a mountain, making it difficult for Lu Chen to breathe. As time passed, the silence seemed to be increasing the burden and he was gradually unable to bear it. Fortunately, at this moment, Perfected Lord Tianlan broke the silence again. He said to Lu Chen, the demonic techniques of the devil sect confuse one's Dao heart and harm one's foundation. From now on, don't use them anymore. Lu Chen was slightly relieved. However, before he could truly heave a sigh of relief, Perfected Lord Tianlan suddenly took a step forward and stretched out a hand, flicking out a finger. Ding! His finger flicked the edge of the black dagger. In an instant, several cracks suddenly appeared on the dark killing weapon and spread wildly. In the blink of an eye, after a muffled sound, the black dagger suddenly turned into countless tiny fragments and fell to the ground, turning into dust. Lu Chen's body shook violently. Suddenly, he let out a muffled groan and a green aura flashed across his face. Then, he suddenly covered his chest with his hand and took 2 steps back. Immediately after, he spat out a mouthful of blood. He seemed to have suffered a heavy injury and almost knelt on the ground. At the same time, Perfected Lord Tianlan's figure appeared beside him like a ghost. He placed a palm on his back and a pure, righteous, and warm power that was like the morning sun surged into Lu Chen's body, suppressing all the evil power that was about to explode in his body. His deep and thick voice echoed in Lu Chen's ears. It's my negligence. From today on, you will follow me to practice Dao techniques. I will teach you the magical power of the word heaven. Chapter 6:12. Most people in the world would probably be extremely moved and excited when they heard Perfected Lord Tianlan's promise. Lu Chen gritted his teeth with a pained expression on his face. He was enduring the backlash from the destruction of the black sword that he had cultivated with his life. His facial expression did not show any of this. However, his mood was still fluctuating, although not that strong. Since when did he start to distrust this divine transformation stage perfected Lord who had raised him and taught him to be an adult? Lu Chen clearly remembered that many years ago when he was still young, his trust in this person was extremely firm and his belief in him was indestructible. If not for this, he would not have been able to survive those difficult days in the devil cult. Because during that period of time, apart from the physical fights, it was actually more of a mental torture. A person's trust could be pure, but if there was the slightest suspicion at the beginning, even if it was just a small crack, it would quietly and slowly expand, and one would think of many things that one would not care about or think about in the past. Just like the words he had just said about his teacher's kindness, words that were enough to make one shed tears of gratitude. As Lu Chen endured the pain on his body with a pained expression, he couldn't help but secretly think in a dark corner of his heart, have I really been negligent? Even if he really had countless important things to do and plans for his only personal disciple, would he really neglect to teach his disciple? Or perhaps, in the previous days, he had other plans in mind. Lu Chen felt that at this moment, he suddenly understood what the saying, "people's hearts are unpredictable," meant. This person's mind was too hard to guess, and it was already very difficult for him to trust him unconditionally like before. After a long while, the pain in his body was slowly suppressed. Perfected Lord Tianlan's expression relaxed a little, and he withdrew his palm and straightened up. Lu Chen moved his body and felt that the meridians in his body that had been damaged by the backlash had almost been completely repaired. He was secretly a little speechless, so he nodded to Perfected Lord Tianlan and then said after a moment of hesitation, "Thank you." "Thank me for what?" Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at him playfully and said, "Are you thanking me for helping you or thanking me for saying that I would teach you Dao skills and mystiques?" Lu Chen said, "I guess so. At least today, I feel like I didn't become your disciple in vain." Perfected Lord Tianlan was stunned for a moment, and then he suddenly grinned as if he was happy. He even patted Lu Chen on the shoulder and said with a chuckle, "Boy. Live well. You still have a long life ahead of you." "Yeah," Lu Chen nodded and said, "It wasn't easy for me to live to this day. I don't want to die." Perfected Lord Tianlan burst into laughter. The deep laughter seemed to have broken the somber and mournful atmosphere in the courtyard, causing the surrounding colors to become much warmer. Perfected Lord Tianlan seemed to be born with this ability. He could change the world around him with his own strength, instead of going with the flow and adapting to this world. When his gaze returned to the courtyard, it was clear that he had not forgotten the original purpose of his visit. His gaze once again fell on the blood-colored figure on the ground. After sizing it up a few times, he raised his head and looked further into the courtyard. Many places in the spacious courtyard were covered by blood, including the walls, railings, and corners. There was blood everywhere, including the edge of an inconspicuous well at the back of the courtyard. Perfected Lord Tianlan's gaze swept across the well. After pondering for a moment, he turned to Lu Chen and said, "There's something that I need you to do for me." Lu Chen was a little surprised. He did not expect Perfected Lord Tianlan to suddenly make such a request at this time, but he still said, "What do you need me to do?" Perfected Lord Tianlan said, "Go back to the entrance on the surface now and ask the guards outside to immediately find Shuang using the most urgent method. Then wait there. When you see Shuang, ask her to arrange 100 absolutely trustworthy subordinates to come to the underground city together. I have something urgent that I need them to do." After a pause, Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at Lu Chen meaningfully and said, "If you don't go and tell her, she probably won't believe me." Lu Chen's heart was in turmoil. He was full of doubts, but in the end, he nodded and agreed to it. Then, he turned and walked out of the courtyard. When he walked out of the gate of the residence, he could not help but look back. He could no longer see Perfected Lord Tianlan's tall figure. He did not know why, but he felt that something was not right. What urgent matter could this damn Baldy have? Why did this order give him the feeling that it was deliberately sending him away? Lu Chen frowned. After hesitating for a moment, he shook his head and walked quickly to the entrance on the surface. In the backyard, Perfected Lord Tianlan stood quietly on the spot. He seemed to have waited patiently for quite a while. Even though there was a distance between them and a high wall between them, and he didn't even turn his head, this deity transformation stage true monarch seemed to be able to clearly see Lu Chen's every move, or rather, feel everything. Only when Lu Chen strode far away did he slowly open his eyes. There was a somewhat deep look on his face. Then, he swept his gaze across the courtyard. A gust of wind blew past, his robe fluttered slowly. Suddenly, there seemed to be lightning flashing in the depths of his eyes, suddenly becoming sharp. On the ground that was covered by the pool of blood, on the ground not far from that blood-colored figure, slowly, a footprint appeared. It was a footprint stained with blood. Then, there was a second, a third, one after another, the footprints slowly extended forward until they stopped at the edge of the well. Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled somewhat disdainfully. His expression seemed to show that he never cared about anything, even if there might be a great enemy hidden here. He did not even bother to make any preparations to investigate or defend himself. He directly flew up and landed on the dry well, looking down. The bottom of the dry well was gloomy and dark, like a bottomless nest. But he did not hesitate at all. He just sneered and then fell down. If Lu Chen were here, he would probably be amazed that the mouth of the dry well was not big enough to accommodate Tianlan's body at all. But this fat man went straight through it unreasonably and fell into the mouth of the well. The darkness below instantly swarmed up. Then, as if there was a malicious ghost howling in the darkness suddenly boiled up. In an instant, countless strong winds rushed over from all directions. All kinds of terrifying ghost faces, demons, ferocious beasts, and even skeletons and spirits swarmed over, covering the sky and covering the earth. They wanted to tear this person who suddenly broke into pieces. Time seemed to freeze at that moment. It seemed that the most terrifying scene in the world was happening in this dark corner. But the face of perfected Lord Tianlan, who was surrounded by countless terrifying existences in the faint light, did not change at all. He still had that contemptuous and arrogant look on his face. He flicked his sleeves as if he was a little annoyed. A strong wind suddenly rose and suddenly broke the silence. Like a sledgehammer chiseling into solid ice, the scene instantly shattered and collapsed. In the face of absolute and almost terrifying power, all the darkness and fear melted like snow and instantly collapsed. Boom! All the ghost shadows suddenly shattered and turned into fragments that filled the sky. But they could not touch that figure at all. In the whistling sound, his huge body slowly landed on the ground and then looked at the darkness in the dry well. There seemed to be a figure lying in the dark corner in the dim darkness. Chapter 6:13. There was an ancient religion that once left behind a very widespread saying, "All fear and dread is like an illusion, or an illusion." It was hard to say whether this saying was right or wrong, but the wisdom of the sages had been passed down for thousands of years, so there was probably some truth to it. If one cultivated the mind and used one's own heart as the foundation, viewing all things in the world as an illusion, perhaps one would be able to ignore all disturbances and see one's true heart when one cultivated to the highest realm. At that level, regardless of whether one's cultivation was profound or if one numbed oneself, the effect would be about the same. Perfected Lord Tianlan's skills were profound and his knowledge was unfathomable. Of course, he knew a thing or two about this ancient doctrine. However, he had always scoffed at it. Moreover, his cultivation method was the pinnacle of worldly affairs, which was the complete opposite of this school of thought which focused on worldly affairs. He didn't even believe in karma and retribution, believing that everything in the world was under his control. What retribution in the next life? What cycle of reincarnation? In his eyes, all of them were illusions. Only great power was fundamental, and only this life and this world was the only one. Since ancient times, countless legends of gods had been passed down in the human world, but had they ever seen one in thousands of years? Where were the gods, demons, immortals, and Buddhas of the heavens? There was a blue sky above and a thick earth below. No matter how many tragic things happened, they would probably pass quietly like flowing water and floating clouds, not leaving many traces. He stared at the black shadow, his heart suddenly filled with a rare feeling. He put his hands behind his back and looked down at the man. He actually recalled the path he had walked for most of his life. He then smiled, without the slightest bit of regret. The shadow in the darkness trembled slightly, like a person on the verge of death subconsciously twitching. Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at him with a calm expression and said, "We meet again." His deep voice echoed in the dark dry well, deep and vaguely carrying a strange power, causing the shadow to tremble again. Then, a strange red light suddenly flashed in the darkness, like the angry eyes of a fierce beast about to bleed. However, Perfected Lord Tianlan didn't care about it at all. He seemed to always be high and mighty, and nothing could affect his mind, not even his basic emotions. He even took a few steps forward and stood beside the human silhouette in the darkness. He touched the body of the black figure with his foot. The figure turned over and rolled on the ground. Supreme Lord Tianlan let out a sigh and casually sat down on the ground. He no longer looked at the black shadow but raised his head to look at the sky above the dry well. The red and mournful light of the blood moon flickered above the small well. Looking from here, it seemed that the whole world outside was blood red. "Are you going to die?" He opened his mouth and said, "Although this is your original fate, I'm still quite surprised. You've been pestering me with all your might for so many years, yet you've actually fallen into the hands of these young people at such an old age. I'm very surprised." "Ah!" Roar. In the darkness beside Perfected Lord Tianlan, the figure flipped over and seemed to struggle on the ground for a few times, uttering vague sounds that were filled with deep-rooted hatred and anger. His gaze was like a blade in the darkness, filled with vicious curses as he glared at Perfected Lord Tianlan. Retracting his gaze, Perfected Lord Tianlan turned to look at him. "Seems like you've woken up. That's good too. At least you'll know when you die." He smiled and said, "I know what you want to say. Do you want to know what's going on with the child I snatched away from you back then?" "Ah!" A low and hoarse howl came from the darkness. It was as if the pain and hatred accumulated over countless years had erupted at this moment. However, this was meaningless to Perfected Lord Tianlan. He didn't even bat an eyelid. He looked like a god without any human emotions, looking down at the pain of the people indifferently. He opened his mouth and said, "Have you been telling yourself all these years that you'll just pretend that you don't have that child? Perhaps one day, I'll directly kill that child. So, as long as you take revenge on me and think of a way to kill me, it'll be considered revenge?" The black figure fell silent. Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled and said, "Look, everyone is like this. I can always see through your thoughts. You all think that things will get better and that things might be as you wish. However, you probably understand me a little, don't you?" He lowered his head and his voice seemed to have become softer. "But in the depths of your heart, is there a voice telling you that I won't do that? How could someone like me do something so superficial? I'll definitely set up a backup plan and teach that child a good lesson. I'll make you suffer the most terrifying pain in the world. That's my way of doing things, right?" Roar, roar. A series of roars suddenly rang out. The black figure trembled all over as if he was about to pounce on Perfected Lord Tianlan. He was already extremely furious. However, Perfected Lord Tianlan shook his head and said, "Stop pretending. I won't tell you. You'll always have to fantasize like this. Imagine how much pain that child has suffered under my hands. Imagine what kind of hell and torment he might be going through right now. There are countless miserable things in this world. Sorrow, pain, torture, and madness. You can't help but wonder if they'll happen to him." Perfected Lord Tianlan's voice reverberated in the dry well like the judgment of a god. The black figure quietened down. He slowly lowered his head and no longer made a sound. Perfected Lord Tianlan stood up and took a few steps outside. At this moment, the blood moon above his head suddenly lit up. It was as if the light had suddenly become several times brighter. For a moment, the blood-colored light actually shone down on the dry well, dispersing the surrounding darkness. It formed a strange light beam that shone on his body. It looked as if the light had descended from the sky and enveloped his body. Perfected Lord Tianlan stopped and looked up. His expression was still rather calm. He only frowned slightly as if he was a little surprised but not worried. However, when the blood-colored light shone into the depths of his eyes, the bald Perfected Lord's body suddenly trembled. Then, a look of confusion slowly appeared on his face. At this moment, a shrill howl suddenly rang out in the darkness of the dry well. Countless ghosts and spirits that had long dissipated appeared again and pounced on Perfected Lord Tianlan from all directions. Among the thousands of mournful shadows, one particularly resolute figure charged over with an aura of death, wanting to perish together with this person. Perfected Lord Tianlan's eyes suddenly seemed to be lit up with two balls of scorching golden flames, as if two suns were rising. At the same time, the blood moon in the sky that had never changed suddenly dimmed a little at this moment. In the next moment, Perfected Lord Tianlan's body shone brightly like a blazing sun. He looked down at the weak darkness and pitiful ants in disdain. Majestic and invincible, he spread out in all directions. Chapter 6:14. Lu Qin stood at the entrance of the tunnel, frowning slightly as he looked at the long street in front of him. The number of people on the street had gradually increased, but he still hadn't seen Shui Ying's figure. He raised his head to look at the sky, feeling an inexplicable anxiety in his heart. Right now, Perfected Lord Tianlan was alone in the mysterious underground cave. This made Lu Qin feel a rare sense of impatience. He really wanted to turn around and return to the underground cave to see what Perfected Lord Tianlan was doing. Of course, he wasn't worried about the damned Baldy's safety. Although it sounded like he was a little unfilial as a disciple, sometimes Lu Qin would be surprised to find that his confidence in his master, who always had complicated emotions, was firmer than most people in this world. There probably wasn't anyone in this world who could assassinate that damned Baldy, right? If there really was such a powerful person, Lu Qin would probably, even applaud in amazement. However, from his previous words and actions, Lu Qin clearly felt that the damned Baldy probably had some secret that he didn't want him to know, so he deliberately sent him away. What was that secret? Was it related to that underground city, or to that mysterious missing bloody man? Lu Qin had thousands of questions in his heart, but he still stood there rationally, waiting for Shui Ying's arrival. The leader of the guards at the cave entrance, Lu Ting, was also standing next to Lu Qin. When he looked at Lu Qin, his eyes were filled with intimacy and gratitude. It was obvious that he was grateful for the kind words that Lu Qin had said in front of Lord Tianlan. After standing with Lu Qin for a long time, he sensed that Lu Qin was a little anxious. After hesitating for a moment, he comforted him. It will take a while for the messenger to reach the mountain from here. He also needs to report to Hall Master Shui. After that, as you said, it will take some time for Hall Master Shui to send 100 people over. Young master, don't be anxious. Wait a little longer. Lu Qin nodded slightly, knowing that Lu Ting was right. In fact, he had deliberately confused Lord Tianlan's intentions when he sent the message just now. According to the damned Baldy's original intention, he probably wanted Shui Ying to come over first, then let Lu Qin personally tell her to send people, and then enter the underground together. All sorts of delays and wasting time would take a long time even with Fuyunji's usual efficiency. Lu Qin didn't believe that Perfected Lord Tianlan had said something wrong or that he hadn't thought of these things. Even if everyone in the world went crazy, he felt that the last person left with a clear mind would be the dead Baldy. Therefore, it was obvious that this guy was deliberately delaying so that Lu Qin and Shui Ying would come over later. What was he planning to do alone in the underground city, in that house full of bloodstains? Lu Qin didn't know, but Lu Qin was very anxious. He felt a faint uneasiness in his heart, as if he had missed something important, or something big was about to happen. However, it was as if he was separated by a high wall, unable to see or hear anything. Time was still passing bit by bit. Although Lu Qin's face hadn't reached the point where he would lose his composure in anger, his expression had already become gloomy. Fortunately, at this moment, Lu Ting, who was beside him, suddenly exclaimed in surprise, then pointed to the sky and said, "Young master, Hall Master Shui and the others are here." Shuang had indeed come. Just as Lu Chen's rumor had requested, a team of 100 people had come with her. Each of them looked taciturn, but their auras were deep and powerful. Needless to say, they were definitely the most reliable and powerful elite troops in Fuyunji. When this group of people arrived, the guards guarding the tunnel entrance were immediately intimidated. One by one, they retreated, some of them even pressing their backs against the wall. These elites were obviously very experienced. In an instant, several of them surrounded the entrance of the tunnel, guarding the most important throat area. Shuang walked in front of Lu Chen and glanced at him. Even though Lu Chen had been on bad terms with her recently, he couldn't help but admire this woman's ability to handle matters. For so many years, she had always been the #1 confidant of Lord Tianlan, and was known as the most powerful woman on Mount Tianlong. There was indeed a reason why she was called the most powerful woman on Mount Tianlong. However, this was obviously not the time to praise, flatter, or get close to him. Lu Chen pulled Shuang to the side and used the simplest words to describe what had happened. "In the end," he said, "that's what happened. I'm just passing on Master's words. I'll have to trouble you." Shuang nodded. Her face didn't show any displeasure at being ordered around by Lu Chen. She only said calmly, "You did the right thing. Now that everyone is here, shall we go down now?" Lu Chen had been in a hurry to return to the underground city, but when the time came, he subconsciously hesitated. However, he quickly nodded and said, "All right, follow me." 5 of the elite troops stayed behind to guard the exit, while the rest followed Lu Chen and Shuang into the underground. This caused the expressions of Lu Ting and the other guards to turn ugly. Some of them even looked angry. However, Shuang ignored them, and Lu Chen didn't say anything. He understood what Shuang was thinking. Currently, the 3 most important and powerful people in Fuyunji's faction had all entered a dangerous place, and it just so happened that there was only one exit. Therefore, the importance of guarding this place became obvious. This had nothing to do with trust, it was just a necessary guarantee. Along the way, Lu Chen and Shuang quickly saw the blood moon, as well as the blood-colored moonlight that was everywhere in the underground cave. Just as Lu Chen called out to Shuang and pointed in the direction of the house, he was about to walk in that direction when suddenly, the ground of the underground cave shook violently. This vibration was extremely strong, to the point where even these elites with cultivation were almost thrown off their feet when they were unprepared. The surrounding stone walls and stone domes buzzed, and many shattered stones fell down. In an instant, everyone's expression changed. This scene looked too similar to an earthquake. There was a limit to one's strength. No matter how strong one's cultivation was, if they really encountered a natural disaster, they would be helpless. At that moment, countless people had the thought that the heavens wanted Fuyunji to die. Fortunately, it seemed that the heavens still wanted to give the damned Baldi some face. The shaking only lasted for a while before it calmed down. The falling stones also gradually stopped. While everyone was still in shock, before anyone could say anything, a dazzling beam of light suddenly burst forth from the center of the empty underground city in front of them. It was as if the sun had exploded, forcing back the blood moon's radiance that filled the sky. In the golden light, a figure slowly rose, 100,000 zhang of light enveloped his body, shining brilliantly, as if a real god had descended to the world. It made people worship him. Around Lu Chen, there were people who became excited. However, when he looked at the light in shock, looking at the damned Baldi in the light who was displaying his power like a miracle, he suddenly faintly saw that at the end of the light, behind the glory, a dark shadow flickered in the light. Like a person quietly waving his hand, but also like a desperate struggle, then it dissipated in the brilliant light, turning into nothingness and ashes. Lu Chen stared blankly at the scene in the distance. He was at a loss, but he suddenly felt a pain in his heart. He did not know where it came from. Chapter 6:15. Even though there had been a violent tremor on that day, and nearly 100 people had witnessed the godlike appearance of Supreme Lord Tianlan in the underground city, this news did not spread throughout Zhengxianmeng in the end. This was not an easy task for Zhengxianmeng, which was already like a sieve, because both Supreme Lord Tianlan and Shuang had given the order to keep it a secret after the incident. This also proved that the 100 people that Shuang had brought with her this time were reliable enough, and no one had leaked the news to the outside world. However, although outsiders did not know the specifics of what had happened, it did not mean that no one had noticed anything strange. In the true Immortal Alliance, which was the world's largest Vanity Fair of intrigue, spying on each other and infiltrating each other were common occurrences. Even the guards at the entrance of the tunnel were actually spied on by some unknown people both openly and secretly. Needless to say, Shuang had suddenly gathered her elite subordinates, and there were quite a few of them. This was a huge commotion, and it immediately alarmed many people and forces, causing them to pay attention to this place. After all, Fuyunji was currently the most powerful hall in the limelight, and it was the place that all the major forces valued the most. What was Fuyunji doing? What were they doing underground? Within a day, this question had become the question in the hearts of many forces and leaders in Zhengxianmeng. Probing and investigations regarding this matter had also begun without batting an eyelid. The leader of Zhengxianmeng's Grand Chancellor, True Lord Guangbo, had a somewhat controversial reputation in the world of cultivators for many years. As one of the 6 true lords of Zhengxianmeng, of course, he had a respectable status, and was worthy of the phrase, high position and power. However, for so many years, he had been in charge of Zhengxianmeng's money and power. Rumors of corruption and borrowing money to make money had always been heard, and voices of criticism could often be heard on the streets. True Lord Guangbo had always scoffed at such a phenomenon, and bitterly hated it. He claimed that he had worked his heart out for Zhengxianmeng, used the great hopes of the world to prosper the Raising Immortals Union, supported the weak, rewarded the heroes, and made great contributions to the growth of Zhengxianmeng. He even said that without him, Zhengxianmeng would not have been able to develop to such a strong state today. Not to mention that without his strong financial support, probably Zhengxianmeng and Fuyunji would not have been able to completely defeat the remnants of the evil cult. When such a great credit was put on his head, True Lord Guangbo did not feel embarrassed or hesitated at all. At his level, he had everything, so what did it matter to chase after a little fame? But recently, True Lord Guangbo found that he seemed to have thought wrong before. He felt that he did not have enough fame and fortune. The title and reputation of the most powerful person in the world, the most powerful person in the Immortals Union, did not belong to him, but to Tianlan, who always wore a big bald head? There were so many treasures, gold and silver. Didn't it say that the wealth of the major sects in Zhengxianmeng should be managed by the Grand Chancellor? Why did all the major sects, especially Fuyunji, dare to seize so much? They despised the golden rule set by Zhengxianmeng that year. They were all ambitious and treacherous officials. If I don't come out to uphold justice, won't it be like a long night without light? Why does the world look a bit chaotic? Perfected Lord Guangbo suppressed the surging and scorching thoughts in his mind, took a sip of tea, and said to Perfected Lord Guyu. The two of them were drinking tea in a secluded garden behind the starry hall. There was no one in the garden, and True Lord Guangbo had deliberately hidden his tracks and came here quietly. True Lord Guyu looked at him and poured another cup of immortal tea for him, then smiled and said, "Why, Brother Guangbo cares about the world so much. Did you see any injustice again? There are many injustices in the world." Immortal Guangbo said to him bluntly, "Let's talk about the last time we met with old man Tai Hu. I should have been the leader. After all, I was the one who organized everyone to do this big thing, but the two of you pushed me aside. It's really sad." True Lord Guyu nodded with a smile and said, "Speaking of this, I still admire Brother Guangbo very much. It's great that you can look at the big picture." True Lord Guangbo sneered and said, "What big picture? Don't say such things in front of us. The reason why I temporarily endured it that day was because of the look you gave me at the end. Today, I'm here to hear what you have to say about me. If it's really the same old nonsense, don't blame me for turning against you." True Lord Guyu nodded and seemed to have no intention of beating around the bush. He said directly, "Okay, Brother Guangbo is a straightforward person, then I'll be straightforward." He pointed to a direction far away from Mount Tianlong and said, let's cut to the chase and speak the truth. Based on the current strength of the Fuyun office and Tianlan, do you, me, Tai Hu, as well as the Golden Dragon and Drifting Cloud clans have the capability to contend against them? True Lord Guangbo frowned and stared at True Lord Guyu for a moment, then said lightly, not a single one, that's it. True Lord Guyu said to True Lord Guangbo, now that Fuyunji is powerful and in the limelight, this is the reason why we have to secretly form an alliance to fight against them. If that's the case, when there's a battle in the future, the one who is at the forefront will probably suffer the most, right? True Lord Guangbo was stunned for a moment. Suddenly, his eyes brightened and said, you mean to let the old man Tai Hu go to the front to block them? But then he shook his head and said, the old man Tai Hu is a cunning old man, he won't be fooled so easily. True Lord Guyu said lightly, since he's the leader and wants to get the biggest share of the benefits, I'm afraid it won't be justifiable if he doesn't put in the most effort. If that's the case, we can just say that we're all breaking up. I don't believe that Tai Hu will really give up those things that he has already marked as his territory. Moreover, he smiled and continued, when it really comes to that, everyone will have already turned against each other. Tianlan will definitely know that the leader of our side is Tai Hu. If the situation suddenly changes and we quit, don't you think Tai Hu will panic? Do you think Tai Hu will dare to deal with that lunatic Tianlan alone? Will he have no choice but to try his best to maintain this alliance and put all his assets on the table to fight with all his might? True Lord Guangbo stared at True Lord Guyu for a while and suddenly gasped. He said, good plan. Brother Guyu, I've really underestimated you in the past. True Lord Guyu waved his hand and said, it's just a small trick. You and I are close friends. All these years, the Grand Chancellor has taken good care of the Star Hall. That's why I'm telling you these things. I hope you won't blame me, Brother Guangbo. True Lord Guangbo laughed and said, not at all. We'll do as Brother Guyu says. After that, he pondered for a moment as if he suddenly thought of something. He then said, oh yes, speaking of this, I wonder if you also felt the movement at the foot of Sky Dragon Mountain? It should be caused by Tianlan, right?